The wind had teeth. It was a high, lonesome sound that scoured the high desert of the New Mexico territory. A keening wail that promised the bone-deep cold of winter was not far behind. Late autumn of 1891 had brought with it a freakish, unseasonal storm, and the rain came down not in sheets, but in bullets of ice-cold water that hammered a frantic, ceaseless rhythm on the corrugated tin roof of the Cedar Mesa ranch house. The sound was deafening, a relentless assault that seemed to want to tear the structure from its very foundations and cast it into the churning darkness. Out in that darkness, a lone figure fought her way through the gale. Laurel Vance felt as though she were wading through a river, the wind a physical current pushing against her, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her wool dress, a faded gray garment that had seen far better days, was saturated, clinging to her slender frame like a leaden shroud. Each step was a monumental effort, her worn-out boots sinking into the mud that was once a hard-packed yard. She clutched a folded piece of paper to her chest, shielding it with her body as if it were a living thing. In a way, it was the letter, bearing the officious crest of Armitage Freight, was both a death warrant and her last, desperate anchor in a world that had turned its back on her. It was a demand for a debt she could never hope to pay. A final notice that threatened to take the last thing she had left of her husband, the simple wooden cross that marked his grave. The ranch house loomed before her, a dark, angular shape against the tumultuous sky, its windows black and unforgiving. A single, defiant flicker of gold shone from a downstairs window, a beacon in the maelstrom. It was a fool's errand, she knew, to knock on a stranger's door at midnight, in the middle of a storm, looking like a drowned rat. But foolishness was a luxury she could no longer afford. Desperation was her only currency now. Reaching the solid oak of the main door, she hesitated for only a moment, gathering the last of her courage. Her knuckles, raw with cold, rapped against the wood. The sound was pitifully small, almost swallowed by the roar of the wind and rain. She knocked again, harder this time, a frantic, desperate drumming that was more a plea than a summons. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside echoed through the wood, and the door swung inward with a low groan. The man who stood there was carved from the shadows by the warm, unsteady light of an oil lamp held aloft in his hand. Cole Maddox was shirtless, the lamplight gliding over the hard planes of his chest and the defined muscles of his arms and shoulders, all slick with a sheen of moisture. His dark hair was wet, plastered to his forehead as if he'd just come in from the storm himself. He wore a pair of rough, canvas work trousers, stained with mud and grease. A faint, silvery scar traced a path down his ribcage, a pale line against his tanned skin that spoke of a past violence. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his jaw set, his dark eyes narrowed with a mixture of irritation and surprise. The sight of him, so suddenly and powerfully there, stole the last of Laurel's breath. The raw, masculine reality of him was overwhelming. "What do you want?" His voice was a low rumble, impatient and rough around the edges, yet it carried easily over the din of the storm. Laurel found her own voice was a fragile, trembling thing. "Work," she stammered, the word barely a whisper. She pushed a stray strand of wet hair from her eyes, her gaze skittering away from his bare chest to a point somewhere on the floor behind him. I'm looking for work. I can do anything. Cooking, cleaning, mending, anything. I need a place to stay for the night, out of the rain." From somewhere deep within the house, the plaintive bleat of a newborn calf echoed, a fragile sound of life in the midst of the tempest. The wind howled through the open doorway, funneling down the long adobe hallway and making the lamp flame dance wildly, casting their shadows long and distorted against the walls. Cole Maddox didn't move. He stood there, a formidable barrier between her and the sanctuary of his home, his eyes assessing her from beneath dark brows. She could see the conflict in them, the wary suspicion of a man accustomed to solitude and trouble, warring with a flicker of something else, something softer, a reluctant compassion. He had the look of a man who had been hurt before and had no intention of letting it happen again. As the silence stretched, a brilliant, blinding fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire yard in a stark, ghostly white for a split second. It was followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Inside the house, there was a sharp pop, and the golden light of the lamp was instantly extinguished. They were plunged into absolute, disorienting darkness. Before Laurel could even gasp, a strong, warm hand clamped around her upper arm. She felt herself being pulled forward, stumbling over the threshold and out of the biting wind. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the roar of the storm and replacing it with a sudden, profound silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant patter of rain. "Stay put," Cole's voice commanded out of the blackness, his hand releasing her arm. She stood frozen, dripping onto the cool floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear him moving, the soft scuff of his boots on the floorboards, a clink of metal, the scratch of a match. A moment later, a small flame sputtered to life, and he relit the lamp. The warm glow bloomed outward once more, pushing back the oppressive darkness. He didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the crumpled, damp letter she still clutched in her hand. He gestured toward it with his chin. Trouble Laurel's fingers tightened around the paper. "Just a personal matter," he grunted, a non-committal sound. He turned and retrieved a heavy wool blanket from a nearby chest, thrusting it at her. It was coarse and smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. "Get that wet dress off before you catch your death." It was an order, not a suggestion, but his tone was gruffly practical rather than improper. He turned his back to her, offering a modicum of privacy as he busied himself with the hearth, using a poker to stir the glowing embers back to life. Laurel quickly, gratefully, slipped out of the cold, heavy dress and wrapped the warm, dry blanket around herself, huddling into its embrace. When she was decent, he turned back, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "I appreciate the shelter. Mr. Maddox," she said, her voice stronger now. "If you just let me sleep by the fire tonight, I'll be on my way at first light. I won't be any trouble." "I don't hire house help," he stated flatly, his eyes sweeping over her again. But this time, his gaze lingered for a moment on her hands where they clutched the blanket. He saw her fingertips, the skin red and chapped from the cold, but also the unmistakable calluses on her palms and at the base of her fingers. They were the hands of a woman who was no stranger to hard, physical labor. They were not the hands of a helpless drifter. Before he could say more, a sound drifted down from the upper floor. It was a cough, dry and persistent, a hacking sound that spoke of a deep-seated irritation in the lungs. It was a young woman's cough, weak but relentless. Cole's head snapped up, a crease of worry appearing between his brows. "Nora," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Laurel's instincts, honed by years of caring for others, took over. Without a second thought, she moved toward the small kitchenette visible beyond the main room. "Is there a kettle and fresh water?" Cole looked at her. Surprised by her sudden initiative, he gave a curt nod toward a pump by the sink. Over there, while he watched, his arms crossed over his bare chest, Laurel worked with a quiet, efficient grace. She filled the kettle and set it on the cast-iron stove, which still held a residual warmth from dinner. While the water heated, she reached into the small oilcloth satchel she carried, her only worldly possession besides the clothes on her back, and pulled out a small, tied bundle of dried leaves. "Mint," she explained. Seeing his questioning look, it helps to soothe the throat and open the passages. The cough came again from upstairs, followed by a soft, weary moan. Laurel didn't wait for permission. Once the water was steaming, she poured it into a bowl, added the fragrant mint leaves, and grabbed a clean linen cloth from a hook. She wrung it out, the steam rising to mist her face. She looked at Cole, her expression clear and direct. "May I?" It was a silent test. He could have refused, could have sent her back to the fire and tended to his sister himself. But he saw something in her eyes, a steady competence, a genuine concern that had nothing to do with her own desperate situation. He held her gaze for a long moment. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle hiss of the rain outside. Finally, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Up the stairs. First door on the left. He followed her, taking the lamp, his bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The room was simple, furnished with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a table cluttered with vials, jars of dried herbs, and medical texts. A young woman, barely more than a girl, was propped up on the pillows, her face pale and flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. This was Nora. She looked at Laurel with bleary, questioning eyes. Laurel offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice soft and calming. "This will help." She placed the warm, damp compress on Nora's chest. The girl sighed, the warmth and the mint-scented steam seeming to ease her discomfort almost immediately. Laurel sat on the edge of the bed, rewarming the cloth every few minutes, her movements gentle and sure. Cole stood in the doorway, a silent, brooding sentinel, the lamplight throwing his powerful shadow across the room. He watched as, under Laurel's patient care, his sister's coughing fits slowly subsided, replaced by deeper, more even breaths. Soon, Nora's eyes drifted shut, and she fell into a peaceful sleep, quietly. Laurel rose and followed Cole back down the stairs. The tension in the house had shifted. The initial suspicion had been replaced by a grudging respect, and something else, something more delicate and complex. They stood before the hearth, the fire now burning brightly, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled with unspoken thoughts. Laurel was acutely aware of him standing so close, of the heat radiating from the fire and from his body. A stray drop of water, having found its way through a crack in the roof, fell from a ceiling beam and landed squarely on his bare shoulder. It traced a glistening path down his skin before she quickly averted her eyes, forcing herself to stare at the dark, polished floorboards, a blush rising on her cheeks. "You're good at that," Cole said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. "My husband, he was ill for a long time," she replied softly, not offering any more details. She didn't want his pity. He was quiet for a moment, processing that. He looked from her calloused hands to her tired, proud face. He was a man who trusted actions, not words, and he had just witnessed hers. He had seen competence, compassion, and a strength that belied her drenched and desperate appearance. Cedar Mesa was a hard place, and it took a hard kind of person to survive it. He wasn't sure what she was, but she was not weak. Finally, he spoke, his voice decisive. "1 week," he said, breaking the spell. Laurel looked up, her heart giving a hopeful leap. 1 week's trial. He clarified, his expression stern, giving no quarter. "The barns need mucking out, and the kitchen needs a hand. You'll earn your keep, at the end of the week. We'll see. There are no promises beyond that." It wasn't an offer of salvation. It was a chance, a sliver of hope in the heart of the storm. And for Laurel Vance, it was more than enough. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to let spill over into tears. "I won't disappoint you. Mr. Maddox, see that you don't," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You can sleep there, by the fire. We're up before dawn." He turned then and ascended the stairs, leaving her alone in the warm, quiet heart of his house, the wool blanket a shield against the storm that still raged outside, and the one that had just begun to calm within her. The bell at Cedar Mesa Ranch was a harsh, iron clang that shattered the pre-dawn stillness, a summons to war against the cold and the dark. But the bell did not wake Laurel Vance. She had been awake for at least an hour, her body aching with a profound, bone-deep chill that sleep could not touch. She had spent the night on the floor by the hearth, the wool blanket a small defense against the drafts that snaked across the floorboards of the unfamiliar house. Her trial had begun, and she would not be found wanting. Long before the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, she was outside. The rain had subsided to a biting mist, and the air was so cold it felt like breathing in powdered glass. Her first task was the water trough by the main corral. It was old, made of split logs, and a seam had opened, leaking a steady, wasteful stream of precious water into the mud. She found a small stack of tin strips and a handful of short nails in the cluttered, dark cavern of the smithy. Her hands, already raw and tender from the previous night's exposure, protested as she gripped the hammer. The metal was frigid, stinging her palm. She worked with a focused, desperate economy of motion, her breath pluming in the air. She hammered the strips over the leak, her knuckles scraping against the rough, splintery wood. The sharp tack-tack-tack of the hammer, the only sound in the yard. She didn't wince when her skin broke, a thin line of blood welling up. She simply wiped it on her borrowed skirt, one of Nora's, too short and faded, and kept working. From there, she moved to the mangers in the lower barn. The work was heavy and rank, pitching out the sodden, soiled hay and replacing it with fresh bedding. The air was thick with the smells of manure, damp earth, and the warm, milky breath of the cattle stirring in their stalls. The pitchfork was heavy, its handle worn smooth and slick. A deep splinter embedded itself in her palm. She paused only long enough to bite her lip, break the wood off flush with her skin, and continue her work. She would deal with it later. There was no time for weakness. Cole Maddox watched from the loft, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled in his hands. He had been there since she first stepped out of the house, a shadow observing a shadow. He watched her mend the trough, his eyes critical. He saw her knuckles bleed, and he saw her ignore it. He watched her tackle the mangers, the rhythm of her work steady and efficient, her back straight, never pausing to rest. He was a man who judged the world by the quality of its work, and this woman, this half-drowned stranger, worked with a grim determination that he understood. When she finished the stalls and moved on to refilling the water buckets, he descended the loft ladder. He didn't approach her. He went to the stall doors she had tidied, checking the ropes she had coiled and hung. He inspected the new knots she had used to secure a loose gate. It was a taut-line hitch, tied perfectly, clean, tight, and functional. It wasn't the clumsy knot of a housemaid. It was the knot of someone who knew that a loose line could mean a lost animal. He said nothing, his expression as hard and unreadable as the granite of the mesa itself. But a flicker of grudging respect had taken root. As the sun finally broke the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and sullen orange, the other ranch hands emerged, pulling on gloves and hats, their moods as foul as the weather. The foreman, Hank Joslin, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers and eyes as small and suspicious as a boar's, spotted Laurel immediately. She was coiling a heavy rope, her small frame straining with the effort. Hank spat a stream of brown juice into the mud near her boots. "Well, looky here. Mornin'. Duchess, figured you'd be inside warmin' your delicate hands by the fire. Not playin' rancher." Laurel didn't look up, her entire focus on taming the stiff, wet hemp. Hank chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Maddox has gone soft, hirin' out pity cases. A stiff wind comes through. We'll be peelin' you off the south fence. Girly." Laurel finished the coil and hung it on its proper peg. She turned to face him, her expression not angry, but perfectly, chillingly neutral. Her eyes were the color of the sky just before the storm, a clear, depthless gray. "Is there work you need me to do, Mr. Jocelyn?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Or are you just practicing your complaints?" The other hands, who had been grinning, suddenly found their boots intensely interesting. Hank's face darkened, unused to being challenged, especially by a woman. He took a step toward her, his hand clenching. "Why, you little—" "Hank," Cole's voice cut through the tension like a fresh sharpened blade. He hadn't raised it, but it carried an authority that stopped the foreman cold. Cole was leaning against the barn door, his arms crossed. "The south fence line needs checking. Now." Hank glowered, then shot Laurel a look of pure venom before turning and stalking off, shouting at the other men to follow. Laurel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping for just a second before she straightened them again. She turned and walked toward the small outbuilding that served as Nora's infirmary and workshop. She found Nora hunched over a small, trembling calf in a pen filled with clean straw. The little creature, a pale, white-faced heifer, was letting out a pitiful, high-pitched moan, its sides distended and tight. "It's Juniper," Nora said, her voice tight with frustration and worry. She gestured to a few open texts on her workbench. "She's got colic. I've tried everything in the book, but she won't settle. Cole, he's partial to this one." Laurel set down her bucket and slowly approached the pen, making soft, clucking sounds. She ran a hand gently over the calf's swollen belly. The animal trembled but didn't pull away from her touch. "Her mother died birthing her. We've been feeding her on the bottle," Laurel nodded, her gaze sweeping the small, tidy room. "Do you have any dandelion root?" Nora blinked. "Dandelion. I think so. I use the leaves for tea, but the roots—" "And some cornmeal and warm water," Laurel said, already moving to the shelves. She found a jar of the dried, gnarled roots and, using Nora's mortar and pestle, began to grind them into a coarse powder. Her movements were practiced, sure. She mixed the powder with a scoop of cornmeal and enough warm water to make a thick, warm paste. "What is that?" Nora asked, watching with fascination. "A poultice. My mother taught me. It's for bloat." Laurel re-entered the pen and, speaking in a low, soothing monotone, began to massage the warm paste onto the calf's distended belly. Her hands were firm but gentle, working in slow, circular motions. Juniper moaned, kicked her legs weakly, and then, as the warmth and the properties of the herbs began to work, she let out a long, low sigh. Her trembling eased. Laurel continued the massage, her hands now stained with the yellow paste, until the calf's breathing deepened and the painful tension in its stomach visibly relaxed. Within 10 minutes, the little animal was quiet, its eyes half closed in relief. Nora stared, dumbfounded. I've been studying for a year. I've never seen that." "Some remedies aren't in books," Laurel said softly, wiping her hands on a rag. "She'll need to be watched, but I think the worst is past." Nora looked at Laurel with a newfound, profound respect. This woman was more than just a drifter. She was a healer. Later that morning, Cole rode the south fence line, the one Hank was supposed to be checking. He trusted his foreman to do the work, but he trusted his own eyes more. The rain had softened the ground, making it a perfect canvas for stories, and the story it told him today made his blood run cold. Near a section of loose wire by Coyote Draw, he found them. Hoof prints. Not the iron-shod tracks of his own stock or his neighbors. These were the prints of small, unshod ponies, ridden hard and fast, and alongside them, the unmistakable print of a moccasin. The Mesa Rats. The name left a foul taste in his mouth. They were a band of renegades and rustlers, ghosts who lived in the high canyons, striking isolated ranches, taking what they wanted, and vanishing back into the rocks. They hadn't been seen in this territory for months, but these tracks were fresh. They had been scouting his ranch, they had seen his herd, and they had seen his vulnerability. With the Armitage Freight Company squeezing him on transport fees and the early storm threatening his winter feed, a raid now would ruin him. He returned to the ranch house at midday, the weight of this new threat settling heavily on his shoulders. He was met with a smell that stopped him in his tracks. It was a rich, savory aroma that he hadn't smelled in his own home in years. It was the smell of food, real food. He pushed open the kitchen door. Laurel stood at the stove, a clean apron tied around her waist, her face slightly flushed from the heat. A massive pot bubbled on the stove. The kitchen, which was usually just a functional, cold space, was spotless. The surfaces were scrubbed, the floor swept, and a clean cloth was on the table. She looked up as he entered, a wooden spoon in her hand. "I hope you don't mind. Mr. Maddox, Nora said the hands usually just eat salt pork and hardtack. I found some split peas and a ham hock in the larder." He was speechless. He hadn't realized how cold and empty his own house had become until this moment, filled with the simple, profound warmth of a simmering pot of soup. The ranch hands filed in, drawn by the same aroma. They stopped shuffling and talking when they saw Laurel, awkwardly removing their hats and taking their seats. Hank Jocelyn sat at the far end, pointedly ignoring her. Laurel ladled the thick, fragrant soup into bowls and placed one in front of each man, along with a thick slice of fresh bread she had baked that morning. The men ate in a silence that was almost reverent. It was the best meal they'd had in months, perhaps years. It tasted of comfort, of care, of something other than mere survival. Hank finished his bowl, wiping it clean with the last of his bread. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty bowl. Then, with a low grunt, he pushed it forward an inch. He didn't say please. He didn't look at her. But it was, for him, a complete and total surrender. Laurel refilled his bowl without a word. The rain started again in the afternoon, a cold, persistent drizzle. Laurel noticed a leak in the tool shed roof, water dripping onto a pile of valuable seed bags. She didn't wait for instructions. She climbed onto a rickety stool, stretching on tiptoe, trying to plug the hole with clumps of straw and mud. Her hands raw and bare. "You'll get soaked and freeze to death." Cole's voice startled her. He was standing right behind her, holding a hammer and a small square of tin. "And that won't hold. Come down." She stepped down, shivering, mud streaked on her face. "I was just trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do." He swung himself up onto the stool and, in a few deft, powerful movements, hammered the tin patch into place, sealing the leak. He jumped down. "Get inside," he ordered. As she turned to go, he caught her arm. "Wait." He gestured at her hands. They were a mess, caked in mud, the knuckles split and bleeding, the splinter in her palm now an angry red welt. "Your hands." "It's nothing," she said, trying to pull away. He didn't let go. He handed her the hammer, his grip firm. "Go inside. Nora has salve for that." His calloused, warm fingers brushed against her cold, damaged skin as she took the hammer. It was a simple, accidental touch, but a jolt went through both of them, sudden and sharp as a static shock. They froze for a fraction of a second, their eyes meeting. In that moment, the rain, the cold, and the hard work faded, and there was only the electric silence between them, as thick and tangible as smoke. Laurel was the first to look away, her heart hammering. She took the hammer, her voice a whisper. "Thank you." That evening, as Laurel was tidying the main room, she paused at the mantelpiece. A silver-plated photograph frame lay face down, covered in dust. She picked it up. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures obscuring the image. Through the cracks, she could see the face of a woman, her hair dark like coals, but her eyes held a light and a softness that he lacked. She was smiling, her arms around two young children, a small, scowling Cole and a beaming, gap-toothed Nora. "Our mother," Nora said softly from the doorway. Laurel hadn't heard her approach. "She died from the influenza. 5 years back. It broke something in Cole. He was never the same. It's like the whole house went cold the day we buried her, and he never let the warmth back in." Laurel looked at the cold, empty hearth, at the sparse, purely functional furniture. She understood. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress against further loss. Without a word, Laurel put the photograph back. She went to the kitchen, found an empty jam jar, and rinsed it clean. She slipped out the back door into the drizzling twilight and went to a small, sheltered patch of ground by the porch where, earlier, she had seen a stubborn clump of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, their fiery red tips a defiant splash of color against the gray day. She picked a small, humble bouquet, brought them inside, and placed the jar on the center of the kitchen table. It was a tiny, simple act, but it was the first time in 5 years that flowers had been inside the Maddox house. When Cole came in for supper, he stopped dead in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the bright red blossoms. He looked at the flowers, then at Laurel, who was busy at the stove, pretending not to notice, his jaw clenched, a muscle working. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders seemed to change, the tension easing just a fraction. The kitchen, for the first time, felt like a home. Later, when the house was deep in the quiet of the night, Laurel sat by the dying embers of the fire. She pulled the crumpled, damp letter from Armitage Freight from her pocket. She smoothed it out on her knee. She had a tiny stub of a pencil, less than an inch long. She turned the letter over to its blank side. In the dim, flickering light, she wrote 2 words, her script small and tight. 6 days. What's that? His voice from the darkness made her jump, and she fumbled the letter. Cole stood at the bottom of the stairs, a shadow in the gloom. He had seen her writing. He stepped forward into the firelight, his eyes fixed on the paper she was trying to hide. It's nothing. Just a list, she lied, her face pale. He held out his hand. Let me see. It was not a request. Reluctantly, she handed it to him. He turned it over, his eyes scanning the formal, threatening text. His face hardened as he read the name. Armitage. I knew it. What's your debt to that vulture? My husband. He had an accident with one of their wagons. They say he was at fault. They claim damages for the wagon. And you're paying for it. It was his name on the contract, she whispered, shame and grief warring in her. Cole looked from the letter to her face, finally understanding the depth of her desperation. He reached into his own trouser pocket and pulled out a few coins. Here, it's not much, but it's an advance, for the work you did today. Laurel looked at the money in his palm, and then back up at his face. Her pride, the only thing she had left that was truly hers, rose up like a shield. She slowly, deliberately, pushed his hand away. No, Mr. Maddox, I thank you, but no. Don't be a fool, woman, he growled, frustrated. I told you I would earn my keep, she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. I won't take charity. I'm on trial for 1 week. I will earn my pay. I need to earn it. He stared at her, this infuriating, stubborn, and impossibly strong woman. He saw the iron in her spine, and he found he could not, or would not, try to break it. He slowly closed his hand over the coins and slid them back into his pocket. Suit yourself. He turned to go back upstairs, then paused. The silence of the room settled around them again, heavy and charged. The memory of the previous night of him, half naked and soaked, and her, trembling on his doorstep, filled the space between them. It was a raw, vulnerable moment that neither of them had acknowledged, but both of them remembered with a clarity that was almost physical. He remembered the desperate fear in her eyes, and she remembered the startling, undeniable power of his presence. Get some sleep, Laurel, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The bell rings early. He ascended the stairs, leaving her alone with the fire, her countdown, and the unspoken, complicated reality of her new, fragile place in this hard, cold house. Garnet Crossing was less a town and more a collection of buildings held together by dust, grit, and gossip. News, or what passed for it, traveled faster than a horse at full gallop, spreading from the saloon to the general store to the church steps in a matter of hours, and the arrival of a stranger at the Cedar Mesa Ranch was the most significant news the town had seen in a season. The engine of this particular rumor was a woman named Millie Rusk, the proprietress of the Garnet Crossing Saloon. Millie had a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. Leaning over her polished bar, she polished a glass and offered her unsolicited opinion to a pair of dusty cattlemen. Mark my words, she said, her voice a low, confidential rasp. That Vance widow ain't just after a job mucking stalls. A woman who shows up in a midnight storm looking like that. She's got bigger fish to fry. She's aiming for Maddox's heart, and more importantly, his land. She held the glass up to the light, inspecting it for smudges. Cole Maddox is land-rich and lonely, a dangerous combination. The sentiment, sharp and cynical, found fertile ground. It was repeated at the mercantile, whispered over sacks of flour and bolts of calico. It eventually reached the ears of the town's foremost moral authority, Deacon Barstow. Barstow was a man whose piety was as thin as his lips. He served as the town's preacher, but his real business was land acquisition for the expanding railroad, a fact he kept carefully veiled behind a veneer of sanctimony. He saw Cedar Mesa not as a home, but as a crucial, final piece in a puzzle of deeds and rights of way that would make him a very wealthy man. He stood on the church steps, his Bible held tight in one hand, and addressed a small group of his most devout parishioners. His gaze was severe, his tone laden with false concern. "I hear troubling news from the Maddox Ranch. An unmarried woman, a widow of questionable circumstance, residing under the same roof as an unmarried man." He let the words hang in the air. In these trying times, a person's virtue, especially a woman's, must be seen to be as bright and clear as the morning sun. We must pray for their souls. His eyes, however, held no prayer. They held the cold, calculating glint of an opportunist. The whispers soon reached the man with the most to gain from Laurel's misfortune, Ellis Armitage. The owner of the freight company was in Garnet Crossing to collect on several accounts, and the gossip gave him an idea. He found Laurel outside the general store, where she had come with Nora to purchase yeast and thread. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice loud enough for the half-dozen people nearby to hear. "My condolences on your husband's passing and on your current predicament." He smiled, a greasy, unpleasant expression. "The matter of the debt remains, the damages for my wagon. Since you seem unable to pay in cash, I have been forced to explore other assets." Laurel stood her ground, her face pale but her back ramrod straight. "I have no assets, Mr. Armitage. You know that." "Oh, but you do," he said, savoring the public nature of the confrontation. "Your late husband's burial plot. It has value. The land is deeded. If the debt is not settled by the end of the month, I will have no choice but to file a lien and take possession of the plot. I'm sure we can find another place for his remains." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just a threat of financial ruin, it was a threat of desecration. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Laurel didn't flinch. She simply stared at Armitage, her gray eyes turning to chips of ice. The crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their appetite for gossip soured by the naked ugliness of the threat. With this new, shocking development, the rumor mill ground into overdrive. The core fact that Laurel was staying at the ranch had been established. Now, the details were embellished with a lurid, speculative brush. The story became that she was sleeping not just in the main house, but in Cole's bed. It was a lie, plain and simple. She slept on a small, lumpy cot in the pantry off the kitchen, a space no bigger than a closet. Nora, furious and fiercely loyal, tried to set the record straight. "She's a guest, a worker," she insisted to Mrs. Gable at the mercantile. "She sleeps in the pantry. My brother would never," but her protests were drowned out. The truth was mundane. The lie was far more exciting. No one wanted to hear about a cot in the pantry when they could imagine scandal in the master bedroom. The tipping point came on a Saturday night. Hank Jocelyn, his week's wages burning a hole in his pocket, was at Millie Rusk's saloon. A group of ranchers, bored and mean-spirited with drink, started goading him. "Here you got a new cook, Hank," one of them drawled. "A pretty one, too. Maddox keeping her warm for you." Hank, his face flushed with whiskey, bristled. "She ain't nothin' to me, just another mouth to feed." "Oh, I don't know," Millie chimed in from behind the bar. "Seems to me she's more than that to the boss. Funny, A man who ain't hired a woman in 5 years suddenly takes one in, pushed into a corner. His masculine pride stung. Hank made a fatal mistake. He tried to reclaim his status as an insider, to show them he knew more than they did. "That ain't the half of it," he slurred, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I saw him, the night she came, knocking on the door in the middle of that gully washer. Maddox. He opened the door to her. Not a stitch on his top half. Bare as the day he was born from the waist up." A collective, appreciative silence fell over the table. This was the detail they had been waiting for. This was the proof. In the twisted logic of the saloon, a man didn't open his door shirtless at midnight to a woman, unless something improper had been prearranged. Hank's clumsy attempt to assert his importance had just condemned Laurel. The story mutated instantly. By the time it crossed the street the next morning, it was no longer about a man caught unawares by a storm. It was a lurid, detailed account of a planned tryst, a scandalous affair happening right under their noses. The lie was now cemented, ugly, and accepted as fact. The consequences were immediate and tangible. Riders from neighboring ranches began to make excuses to check their fence lines bordering Cedar Mesa, slowing their horses as they passed the house, staring, sometimes even pointing. The increased traffic and the whispers of scandal did not go unnoticed in the wider territory. In the high, rocky canyons, the Mesa rats heard the tales. They heard of a rancher, already squeezed by freight costs, now distracted by a woman and at odds with his own town. A weakened, distracted ranch was a ripe target. They began to watch and to plan. Deacon Barstow saw his opportunity to apply the screws. He found Laurel in town alone, near the livery. He approached her with an expression of deep, paternalistic concern. "My child," he said, his voice a honeyed poison. "My heart aches for you, the wicked tongues of this town. They are relentless." He placed a proprietary hand on her shoulder. She stiffened but did not pull away. "The church can offer you sanctuary. We have a small dormitory for women in difficult circumstances, a clean bed, simple meals, a place to pray and repent." "I have nothing to repent for, Deacon," Laurel said, her voice level. "Of course not," he said smoothly, "but you must consider appearances, your reputation. A stay at the church would silence the gossip." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Naturally, you would be expected to contribute to the church's upkeep. My own quarters, for instance, are in constant need of tidying. A man of God has little time for such worldly things. Your private service in these matters would be most appreciated." The vile implication was unmistakable. He was offering her a bed in exchange for being his personal, private servant, a position whose duties were left deliberately, menacingly vague. Laurel finally moved. She stepped back, dislodging his hand, and looked him directly in the eye. Her gaze was as flat and hard as a piece of slate. "I am not in a difficult circumstance, Deacon," she said, her voice low and clear, each word a perfectly shaped stone. "I have a job. I am a worker at the Cedar Mesa Ranch. If you are truly concerned with my soul, you can pray for it on Sunday." From a distance, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the dust, his face a mask of pious fury. A few days later, Cole rode into Garnet Crossing for supplies. He needed nails for a new corral gate and a fresh spool of barbed wire. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store and pushed through the doors. The usual hum of conversation of cattle prices, of the weather, of local gossip stopped. It did not just quiet down, it ceased to exist. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Millie Rusk, who had been laughing with a customer, froze with her mouth open. Two old men playing checkers in the corner stopped with their hands hovering over the board. Everyone stared. Cole didn't flinch. He let the silence hang for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, he slowly, deliberately, scanned the faces of the people watching him. A cold, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Don't stop on my account," he said, his voice dangerously soft, yet it carried to every corner of the store. "Keep talking. I'm listening." The challenge was laid bare. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence held, thick and hostile. As he walked to the counter, placed his order, paid his coin, and hefted the heavy spool of wire onto his shoulder, he walked out without a backward glance, the silence breaking only after the doors had swung shut behind him. The ride back to the ranch was grim. The open hostility was worse than the whispers. That evening, the three of them sat in the kitchen, the mood as heavy as an anvil. Nora, ever the pragmatist, finally broke the silence. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "We can't fight them like this. We can't fight whispers with silence." She looked from Cole's stony face to Laurel's pale, proud one. "I have an idea. Let's invite people over, not the gossips, but the decent ones. Mr. Henderson the blacksmith, the Gables from the next ranch over, people with fair minds. We'll have a simple dinner, nothing fancy. We'll let them come here, see for themselves how things are. Let them see the truth with their own eyes. You can't argue with fresh-baked bread and an honest table." It was a good plan, a brave plan. Laurel was deeply touched by Nora's unwavering faith in her, but her pride, the thing that had carried her through widowhood and poverty, was a fierce, unbending core of iron within her. She slowly shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Thank you, Nora. But no, I won't be put on display like a prize pig at the county fair. I won't beg for their approval or lean on their pity. I came here for work. I will be judged on the quality of my labor, not on whether they approve of my character." Her moral compass was absolute. She would stand or fall on her own merits. Cole had been watching her, listening to the quiet steel in her voice. He had seen her face down Armitage's cruelty, Barstow's lechery, and now the town's collective scorn, and she hadn't bent an inch. He understood her decision, and he respected it more than she could ever know. He pushed his chair back and rose, his tall frame seeming to fill the small kitchen. He walked over to where she sat and stood beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a fierce, protective resolve. "Then let me be the windbreak." The promise was absolute. He would not ask her to fight. He would stand between her and the storm. He would take the full force of it himself. The lines were drawn. The battle for Cedar Mesa had begun. The fragile peace that had settled over Cedar Mesa was a thing to be measured in breaths, in the quiet moments between the clang of the morning bell and the exhaustion of twilight. The town's hostility was a constant, low-grade fever, but within the boundaries of the ranch, a different kind of tension was growing quieter, warmer, and infinitely more complicated. It existed in the spaces between them, in shared glances over the dinner table and the careful, deliberate way they avoided brushing hands when passing a tool or a loaf of bread. The sun was high and unforgiving one afternoon, beating down on the yard with a dry, white heat. Laurel was helping Cole stretch a new line of barbed wire for the corral he was building. It was brutal work. The wire was stiff and alive, fighting her at every turn, its metal barbs tearing at her leather gloves. She pulled a section taut, while Cole hammered a staple into a post, her muscles screaming in protest. As he finished, she relaxed her grip for a second too soon. The wire sprang back, a living metal snake, and one of the barbs caught the back of her hand, slicing through the worn leather of her glove and opening a long, shallow gash in her skin. She hissed in a sharp breath, more from surprise than pain, and immediately tried to hide it, turning her hand over and clenching it into a fist. But Cole missed nothing. He had the eyes of a hawk, and he saw the sudden, swift motion, saw the way her knuckles went white. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low and devoid of pleasantry. "It's just a scratch," she insisted. Taking a step back, he closed the distance in a single stride, his expression unyielding. He didn't ask again, He simply took her wrist in his large, calloused hand and gently but firmly uncurled her fingers. The gash was welling with bright red blood, a stark line against her skin. "Foolishness," he muttered, the word a rough sound in his throat. He led her, still holding her wrist, to the water pump by the house. He worked the handle until a stream of cool, clear water gushed out. He cupped his hand, letting it fill, and then gently poured the water over the cut. Laurel flinched as the cold shocked the wound, but she stood perfectly still under his touch. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the scent of sun on his skin, of sawdust and leather, and the faint, clean smell of the soap he used. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, to the sound of the gushing water and the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. A low, powerful drum she could feel more than hear. He worked with a surprising gentleness, his rough fingers carefully cleaning the grit from the wound, his touch as focused as a surgeon's. When he was satisfied, it was clean. He pulled a clean bandana from his back pocket and, tearing a strip from it, expertly wrapped her hand. His knuckles brushed against her palm, and the contact, skin on skin, was a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity. She looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. His dark eyes were fixed on his task, a deep furrow of concentration between his brows. He was a man of immense physical power, yet his hands were as tender as a mother's. When he was done, he tied the knot, and his gaze finally lifted to meet hers. For a long moment, they just stood there, his hand still loosely holding her wrist, the sound of the world fading to a dull hum. He was the first to break the contact, dropping her hand as if it were a hot coal and taking a half step back, clearing his throat. "Nora has carbolic salve," he said, his voice gruff again. The moment of intimacy shattered. "Put some on that tonight." He turned and walked back to the unfinished corral without another word, leaving her with a neatly bandaged hand and a heart that was beating far too fast. A few days later, Nora had them both cornered in the kitchen. She had been experimenting with a new bread recipe and needed an opinion. The room was warm and filled with the heavenly scent of baking. A fine dusting of white flour coated almost every surface, including a smudge on Laurel's cheek. "It needs more salt, doesn't it?" Nora fretted, holding out a piece of the warm loaf for Cole to try. "I followed the recipe exactly, but it tastes flat." Cole took the bread and chewed it thoughtfully. "It's fine, Nora. Good. Even." "No, it's not," she insisted. Just then, the distinct, distressed bleating of Juniper, the orphan calf, carried from the barn. Nora's head snapped up. "Oh, that's her 'I'm tangled in my rope again' cry. I swear, that animal is more trouble." She wiped her floury hands on her apron and bustled toward the door. "Be right back. Don't eat it all." She left them alone in the warm, fragrant kitchen. The silence that fell was comfortable, a familiar quiet that had grown between them. Laurel turned back to the dough she was kneading, her hands moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. "She worries too much," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "She cares," Laurel corrected softly, not looking up from her work. "It's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he moved. Stepping closer to the table where she worked, he reached out, his calloused thumb and forefinger moving with an unthinking, instinctual slowness. Laurel froze as he gently brushed the smudge of flour from her cheek. His touch was feather light, a whisper of contact against her skin, but it sent a cascade of warmth through her entire body. His eyes were dark, intense, his gaze searching hers. It was a moment of pure, unscripted tenderness, a gesture so at odds with his usual guarded nature that it felt like a revelation. Then, just as quickly, he pulled his hand back, a flicker of something surprise, fear, confusion crossing his face. He clenched his hand into a fist at his side, as if he had just touched a hot stove. He cleared his throat again, the sound rough and loud in the quiet kitchen, and turned abruptly toward the door. "I need to check on the horses." He was gone before she could even find her breath. Laurel stood motionless, her hands buried in the soft dough, her cheek tingling where he had touched her. That night, the wind rose again. It wasn't rain this time, but sand, a low hissing wind that picked up the fine red dust of the mesa and threw it against the house, rattling the windows and finding its way through every crack and crevice. It was a dry, choking storm, and it was especially dangerous for the new calves, whose lungs were too delicate to handle the dust. "We have to move them into the main barn," Cole announced at supper, his face grim. "The birthing shed won't be enough." They worked together in the swirling, gritty darkness, the light from their lanterns cutting blurry, shifting holes in the gloom. The wind howled, and the calves, frightened and disoriented, were difficult to herd. It was well past midnight when the last of the small, trembling animals was safely inside the warm, sheltered walls of the main barn. "We'll have to watch them through the night," Cole said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Make sure none of them take a chill or start coughing." They settled in the hayloft, which offered a clear view of the pens below. The air was still thick with dust, and the wind outside was a relentless, mournful cry. Laurel, seeing Cole squinting against the fine grit that still swirled in the air, untied the simple scarf from her hair. Without a word, she reached over and gently tied it over his nose and mouth. He froze at her touch, but didn't pull away, his eyes watching her over the top of the fabric. A little later, a gust of wind found a loose board in the barn wall, and a blast of cold. Sandy air shot through the loft. Laurel shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Cole, seeing the motion, shrugged out of his heavy leather sheepskin coat. It was a worn, familiar garment, imbued with his scent and the lingering warmth of his body. He draped it over her shoulders. It was huge on her, enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and protection. These simple, silent gestures of care spoke more than 1,000 words ever could. They were a testament to the partnership that was growing between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual reliance. In the quiet hours that followed, with the storm hissing outside and the calves sleeping peacefully below, they began to talk. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and careful, but the shared darkness and the intimacy of their vigil seemed to loosen their tongues. "This land," Laurel began, her voice a near whisper. "It's beautiful, but it's hard. It takes so much." "It gives back," Cole countered, his voice muffled by the scarf. "If you're strong enough to hold on." A silence fell, and then Laurel spoke again, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. "We had a small homestead near Silver Creek. We lost it." She paused. "It wasn't the drought or a blight. It was freight costs, Armitage freight, a bill for hauling seed that was twice what it should have been, then a fee for equipment transport. It was a mountain of paper, a debt that grew faster than we could plant. By the end, we owed them more than the land was worth." She stared out into the darkness, her voice flat and devoid of self-pity. "That's what Armitage does. He finds people when they're down, and he buries them." Cole listened, his jaw tight with an anger that was not for her, but for the injustice she had suffered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, he offered a confession of his own, a piece of his past he had shared with no one, not even Nora. "I was engaged once," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Years ago, before my mother died. Her name was Elizabeth. She was the banker's daughter. It was a good match. Everyone said so." He shifted in the hay. "She wanted to move to Santa Fe. She hated the dust, the wind. She wanted a house with a porch and neighbors. I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave this place. It's all I've ever known. It's in my bones." He let out a long, slow breath. "I was afraid that if I left, I'd lose myself, and afraid that if she stayed, she'd come to hate me for it, so I broke it off. I let her go." He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. I chose being alone over the risk of being left. In the shared vulnerability of that confession, a new, profound understanding passed between them. They were both survivors, both scarred by loss, both terrified of losing what little they had left. And in that shared understanding, something shifted. Laurel looked at his shadowed face, at the pain he kept so carefully hidden from the world, and she smiled. A small, sad, and deeply empathetic smile. "It seems we're both afraid of the same thing. Mr. Maddox," she said softly. Losing our footing, he looked at her, and for the first time, a genuine, unforced smile touched his own lips, reaching all the way to his dark eyes and lighting them from within. "I suppose we are, Laurel." And then, a sound that had not been heard between them before, they laughed. It started as a low chuckle from Cole, a sound of pure, surprised relief. Laurel joined in, a soft, clear sound that was full of a warmth that had been absent for too long. Their laughter mingled in the dusty air of the old barn, echoing in the vast, empty space like the clear, unexpected chime of a bronze bell. It was the sound of two lonely, wounded souls finding a moment of shared grace in the heart of a storm. The sandstorm blew itself out by dawn, and the following days passed in a blur of hard work and unspoken awareness. The memory of that night in the barn hung between them, a tangible thing. The trial period of 1 week had come and gone without a word being said. It was simply understood that she was staying. One evening, after supper, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, silver curtain that washed the dust from the air and brought with it the clean, earthy smell of the desert after a storm. Laurel stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the soothing, rhythmic sound. Cole followed a few moments later. Leaning against a post, his arms crossed, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the rain fall. "It's different this time," Laurel said, her voice quiet. "How so?" "The first time I saw this rain," she said, "it felt like an enemy, like it was trying to wash me away. Tonight, it feels like a promise, like it's washing things clean." He moved to stand beside her, so close their shoulders were almost touching. He didn't speak, but she felt the question in his silence. She turned to face him. The light from the lamp in the house cast a warm, golden glow on her face, illuminating the quiet strength in her eyes. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them on the porch, wrapped in the soft sound of the falling rain. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, to stop him. He lifted a hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. She didn't pull back. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. The kiss, when it came, was as gentle as the rain. It was slow, tentative, a question and an answer all in one. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, bone-deep recognition. It was short and chaste, and it held more meaning than 1,000 fiery embraces. Through the window behind them, the fire in the hearth, which had been burning low, suddenly flared, a bright lick of orange flame that cast their joined silhouettes in sharp relief against the wall. Before settling back into a bed of glowing embers, they broke apart slowly, the space between them now charged with a new, breathtaking electricity. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "Laurel," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She opened her eyes, her gaze clear and steady. She knew what this moment meant, and she knew it was not the right time, not yet. He seemed to understand her unspoken thought. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "When you're ready," he murmured. It was a promise, an offering of patience and respect that she valued more than any declaration of love. She nodded, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "When things are right," she answered, making a promise of her own. A promise that there would be a time for them, a time when the shadows of debt and deceit were gone. It was an unspoken pact they would face Armitage and Barstow, and they would do it together, from the kitchen window, Nora watched them on the porch. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the way her brother looked at Laurel, the way his entire posture had softened. And then she saw something she hadn't seen in 5 long, cold years. She saw him smile, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his hard face. A profound sense of relief washed over her. The house was finally, truly warm again. Out in the yard, hidden by the shadows of the barn. Hank Jocelyn had also witnessed the scene on the porch. He had seen the quiet tenderness, the profound respect in their posture. He had seen the truth, and it was nothing like the ugly, sordid stories he had listened to, and even contributed to. In the saloon, a hot, deep shame burned in his gut. He had misjudged her. He had misjudged them both. He turned and slipped away into the darkness, his own character found wanting. The rain softened to a fine mist. The wind that whispered through the cedar trees was no longer biting, but carried on it the promise of a clean new day. And in the far distance, the lonely, howling cry of the coyotes seemed farther away. Less of a threat, and more a part of the vast, wild, and suddenly hopeful landscape. The new peace at Cedar Mesa was a fragile, brittle thing, like a thin pane of ice over a deep, fast-running river. It lasted less than a day. Cole had ridden out at dawn to check the southern perimeter, the part of his land that bordered the wild, unmapped canyons. He found the track near Coyote Draw, half hidden in the sandy soil. It was the impression of a horseshoe, but it was all wrong. It wasn't the worn, heavy shoe from the ranch forge, nor the mark of his neighbor's stock. This shoe was new, narrow, and factory-made, with a distinct, sharp calkin that bit deep into the earth. It was a cavalry shoe, but no cavalry was stationed within 100 miles. It could mean only one thing: the Mesa Rats. They were not just a vague threat anymore. They were here, on his land, testing his boundaries. He measured the stride between the tracks. It was a small, quick-stepping horse, built for agility in the rocks, not for long. Open-range gallops. He found more tracks, a half-dozen different ponies, all converging on a high bluff that overlooked his house, his barns, his entire operation. They had been there for hours, watching. He rode back to the ranch house not with the hurried panic of a spooked man, but with the cold, heavy certainty of a general confirming his enemy's position. The time for hoping was over. The time for planning had begun. He found Laurel not in the kitchen, but in the feed shed, a place she had taken to organizing with a fierce, quiet efficiency. She was not sweeping or stacking. She was standing perfectly still, her hand resting on a 50-pound sack of oats. He was about to speak when she held up her fingers, her brow furrowed. They were coated in a fine, white powder. "It's on all of them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "All the sacks on the end of the row, the ones nearest the door." Cole touched the powder, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. It was dry, clinging. "Chalk. Lime," she corrected. "We used it on my father's farm to keep the vermin away from the grain, but we also used it for something else." She met his gaze, her gray eyes dark with a sudden, dawning horror. "If you need to find your way in the pitch black, a sprinkle of lime on the ground, it catches the smallest bit of starlight. It almost glows." The two discoveries clicked together in the air between them, locking into place with the cold finality of a jail cell door. Cole's tracks meant the rats were watching. Laurel's lime meant they were done watching. They were acting. They had marked their targets. They were coming for the feed, the lifeblood of the ranch, the only thing that would see Cole's herd through the coming winter. "They're coming tonight," Cole said. It was not a question. "They'll come in the dark," Laurel affirmed. "That's what the lime is for, to guide the man with the torch." The word hung in the air. Torch. Laurel's mind, sharp and practical, was already moving past the fear. "I need to go to town. Now." Cole's head snapped up. "No, it's not safe. After your run-in with Barstow." "It's exactly why I have to go," she insisted, her voice gaining a new, hard edge he had never heard before. This isn't just a raid for feed. Cole, they don't need a marker to steal. They need a marker to burn. I need to know why. Nora, who had come in carrying a basket, overheard the last exchange. You'll need a reason, she said, her face pale but her voice steady. My medical supplies. We're running low on laudanum and carbolic acid. I'll write a list. No one will question a medical need. An hour later, Laurel walked down the single dusty street of Garnet Crossing. The stares she received were as sharp as needles, a barrage of silent, pious judgment. She ignored them, her head held high, and walked directly to the apothecary. But her real destination was the alley that ran between the general store and the land registry office, a place of shadows and whispered deals. As she passed it, she heard voices, low, urgent, and familiar. She didn't slow down, but slipped into the deep shadow of an overflowing rain barrel. Her heart hammering against her ribs, it was Deacon Barstow and Ellis Armitage. The bank in Santa Fe is getting nervous, Armitage was saying, his voice a greasy whine. Maddox is 2 payments behind. He's been selling off stock to cover his freight bills. He's on the edge. He is a stubborn man, Barstow's sanctimonious voice replied. He clings to that land like a dog to a bone. He refused my generous offer again last week. Then we must force the issue, Armitage said. A man can survive a bad debt. He cannot survive an act of God, a fire, Deacon, a terrible, tragic accident. A fire, Barstow mused, tasting the word. Think of it, his hay barn, his winter feed, all gone up in smoke. His herd will starve before the first snow. The insurance. Armitage let out a short, sharp laugh. I had a look at his policy. It's void in cases of proven negligence, an unattended lantern, perhaps, or a raid by renegades that he failed to prevent. With no insurance payout and no feed, he'll be ruined. He will have no choice but to sell the land to you for pennies on the dollar. And the railroad, Barstow added, will finally have its clear path through the mesa. Your freight company will be the sole beneficiary of that route. Mr. Armitage, a lucrative partnership. Just make sure your associates are ready tonight, Armitage said. Make sure they get the hay barn first. Laurel's blood ran cold. This wasn't a simple land grab. It was a conspiracy, a multi-layered, evil plan to destroy Cole utterly. And they were using the mesa rats as their weapon. She slipped away, her list from Nora clutched in her hand, her mind racing. The kitchen at Cedar Mesa became a war room. The sun slanted low through the windows, painting the room in hues of orange and blood red. Laurel laid out the situation with a stark, brutal clarity. They aren't raiders. They're arsonists. They're being paid to burn us out. Starting with the hay barn, Armitage and Barstow are behind it. Cole's face was a mask of cold fury. He paced the room, his fists clenched. Fargo, he bit out. Whit Fargo. He leads the rats. He'd do anything for coin. He's Barstow's torch. Nora was pale, her hands shaking. We have to go to the sheriff. The sheriff in Garnet Crossing lights his cigars with Armitage's money, Cole said grimly. We're on our own. A voice, rough and low, came from the doorway. It was Hank Jocelyn. He stood there, his hat in his hands, his face a picture of profound, deep-set shame. He had been listening. Boss, ma'am, he said, his voice thick. I'm the fool who told those stories in the saloon. I'm the one who gave Barstow the gossip he needed to paint you as, well, what I did was wrong. He looked directly at Laurel. I have wronged you, and I've wronged this ranch. I ain't asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Let me stand guard. Let me be the one to meet him. Cole studied his foreman. He saw the genuine remorse, the desperate need for atonement. You'll do more than stand guard. Hank, we're going to set a trap. Laurel was already unrolling a piece of butcher paper, a charcoal pencil in her hand. They're coming for the hay barn, she said, her hands moving quickly, sketching the layout of the ranch yard. Coal, the wind. I've watched it every night. It shifts after midnight. It blows from the northwest, straight from the barn to the house. Cole's eyes widened as he saw what she meant. If they light that barn, the embers, they'll be on our roof in minutes. They're not just burning the hay, they're burning us out completely. But we know where they're going, Laurel said, tapping the paper. We know what they're after. What if it's not there? We can't move a ton of hay in 2 hours, Hank said. We don't move the hay, Cole said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He pointed to a spot on her map, just behind the barn. My father, he had a fool idea about irrigating the north pasture. He laid hundreds of feet of old wooden pipe running from the creek. It never worked, but the pipes are still there. They run right past the back of that barn. Laurel's eyes lit up. We flood it. We can't stop them from coming, but we can make sure they don't enjoy the visit. The plan came together in a rapid, whispered conference. They would create a bait barn. Hank, the best shot on the ranch, would position himself in the loft of the main barn, which had a clear line of sight. Cole and Laurel would go to the creek and man the old, rusted sluice gate, ready to flood the field the moment they got the signal. But what about the horses? Nora suddenly asked, her face tight with worry. The smoke, the fire. They'll panic. They could be hurt. She looked at her workbench, at her rows of herbs and chemicals. Wait, I have an idea. She began mixing, her hands flying, sulfur, saltpeter, and a large handful of dried mugwort. It's a mix I use to fumigate the infirmary. It creates a massive, thick smoke. It's acrid, stings the eyes, and smells like a polecat's funeral. But it's not toxic. It won't hurt their lungs, but I guarantee no horse will stand for it. The night was heavy and moonless, the air charged with a waiting, electric silence. Hank was in position, his rifle resting on a hay bale. Cole and Laurel were hidden in the deep shadows by the creek, their hands on the iron lever of the sluice gate. Nora was crouched behind the massive water trough, a dozen of her smoke bundles laid out before her, along with a single match. They waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirp of crickets. Then, the crickets stopped. A single, faint scrape of a shod hoof on granite echoed from the dry wash. Then another. They were here. Hank watched them, phantoms in the dark, moving with a practiced, arrogant silence. 4, 5, 6 of them. They were all on foot. Having left their horses in the wash, they moved like snakes, low and fast, straight for the hay barn. One man, larger than the others, carried a torch. Unlit. Whit Fargo. He stopped just yards from the barn door, the spot marked with lime. He pulled a match from his pocket and struck it on his boot. Fwee fwee Hank's whistle, the perfect, piercing cry of a red-tailed hawk, split the night. It was the signal. Now, Cole roared. He and Laurel threw their combined weight against the rusted lever. With a groan of tortured metal, the gate gave way. A torrent of cold creek water surged into the ancient wooden pipes. In the yard, Nora struck her match. She didn't light one bundle. She lit all of them. The effect was instantaneous. A series of small whoops was followed by an eruption of thick, choking, sulphurous white smoke. It rolled across the yard like a dense fog, engulfing the raiders completely. What in? Fargo cursed, the match dropping from his fingers. The men began to cough, their eyes streaming. It's a trap, one of them yelled. Just as they turned to run, the water from the busted pipes, which had been building pressure underground, burst through the dry soil. The ground around the hay barn, which had been hard-packed earth, instantly became a quagmire of ankle-deep, sucking mud. The arsonists were now blind, choking, and stuck. From the wash, their horses, smelling the god-awful smoke, began to scream in terror. They tore free from their tethers and bolted into the night. To the horses, Fargo bellowed. Stumbling through the mud, he clawed his way free, his one thought to escape, in his panicked scramble. The heavy leather saddlebag he wore snagged on a broken fence post. The strap ripped, and the bag fell, unnoticed, into the mud. Fargo scrambled into the darkness, his men scattering like rats behind him. Silence, thick and absolute, fell over the ranch, broken only by the sound of coughing receding into the distance and the gurgle of water pooling in the yard. Slowly, Cole, Laurel, and Hank emerged, their rifles raised. The yard was empty. The smoke, acrid and foul, began to thin. "They're gone," Hank said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "They didn't get the barn," Nora whispered, stepping out from behind the trough. Then Laurel saw it, half submerged in the new mud puddle, a dark, heavy shape. "Cole," he retrieved the leather saddlebag. They took it to the kitchen, the four of them huddling around the table. Cole cut the buckles with his knife and dumped the contents onto the pine wood, a few coins, a plug of tobacco, and a rolled oilskin pouch. Cole unrolled it. Inside was a surveyor's map of Cedar Mesa Ranch. A new boundary line was drawn in red ink, cutting the property in half, giving the entire northern pasture and its water rights to a new, unnamed owner. Folded inside the map was a deed of sale. It was already filled out, deeding that half of the ranch to Deacon Barstow for the sum of $1. And at the bottom, pressed into a drop of hard red wax, was Barstow's official ecclesiastical seal. He was going to buy the land from you, Nora breathed, horrified. After Fargo burned you out and Armitage foreclosed, he'd buy the ruined land for nothing. Cole's face was a terrible thing to see. It was a mask of pure, cold rage. He carefully, precisely, rolled the map and the deed and put them back in the oilskin. "This is it. This is the proof. This connects Barstow to Fargo." "We take it to the sheriff," Hank said, slamming his fist on the table. "No," Cole said, his voice deadly quiet. "The sheriff is a hired hand. We go over his head." He looked at the calendar on the wall. "Judge Inez Cortina. She's a federal circuit judge. She's due in Garnet Crossing in 5 days. She's tough, she's fair, and she answers to no one in this territory. We will present this evidence in her open court." It felt like a victory, a true, hard-won victory. They had a plan. They had the evidence. The illusion of safety lasted until the next afternoon. Ellis Armitage rode into the yard. He didn't dismount, but sat on his expensive horse, his hands resting on his saddle pommel. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, his voice smooth and reptilian. "A word." Laurel, who was hanging bandages to dry on the line, did not stop her work. "Mr. Armitage, I understand there was some excitement here last night. A shame. It seems this ranch is a magnet for trouble." He smiled. "It's fortunate I came by. In reviewing your late husband's accounts, I'm afraid I found another outstanding contract, a very large one, I'm afraid, for a steam-powered threshing machine he ordered just before his unfortunate demise. The delivery was confirmed. The payment is now 60 days past due." It was a lie, a desperate, transparent, badly constructed lie, a last-ditch effort to re-establish his leverage. The Laurel who had arrived in the rain would have wept. She would have pleaded. She would have been broken. But the Laurel standing in the sun, her hands red from lye soap, was a different woman. She calmly pinned the last bandage to the line. She turned, her hands on her hips, and looked up at the man on the horse. Her gaze was as flat and as hard as the desert floor. "A steam thresher," she said, her voice clear and caring in the still air. "That's a very specific claim. Mr. Armitage, you will, of course, have the original, signed bill of lading, and the shipping manifest from the railroad, and naturally, the delivery receipt signed by my late husband." Armitage's oily smile faltered. He sputtered. "I am not required to present my evidence to you in a stable yard." "No," Laurel agreed, her voice dropping, gaining an authority that made the man's horse shift beneath him. You're required to present it in a court of law." She took a step toward him. "So, I suggest you get your paperwork in order." Mr. Armitage. Because Judge Cortina arrives on Monday, she held his gaze, her own unwavering. We will see you in court. She turned her back on him and went inside the house, leaving him alone in the yard, his face purple with rage. He wheeled his horse and galloped away. That night, a feeling of fragile hope settled over the ranch. They had a plan. They had the evidence. They had 5 days. But as Cole and Laurel stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the mesa, they didn't see the new shadow that had replaced the old, a lone figure, patient as stone, watching the house from the high rocks. It was not one of Fargo's scattered men. It was someone new, someone they had not accounted for, and he was not waiting for Monday. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air, which had been still and heavy all day, began to stir, not with a cooling breeze, but with a strange, electrical agitation. The clouds, dark and menacing, didn't roll in from the horizon. They seemed to boil up from the earth itself, pressing down on the mesa, suffocating the light. A low, ominous hum vibrated through the ground, and the cattle in the fields grew restless, their calls taking on a frantic, fearful edge. Cole stood on the porch, his eyes narrowed against the strange, yellow light, a deep unease settling in his gut. It's a dry squall, he said, his voice a low rumble. All wind and no water, the worst kind. The wind came suddenly, a violent, twisting gust that tore at the roof of the house and sent a cyclone of dust and dead leaves spiraling across the yard. It hit the small smithy, where Hank had been sharpening plowshares earlier that day, the embers in the forge still glowing a dull, sleepy red. The wind howled down the narrow brick chimney, and a shower of angry, incandescent sparks erupted from the top, a fiery geyser against the dark sky. They were caught by the whirlwind, a swarm of deadly fireflies, and flung directly into the north pasture, a vast, open field of grass that had been cured to the color and consistency of tinder by the long, dry autumn. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a single, tiny orange flame licked at a clump of grass. It hesitated, then greedily devoured it, growing instantly to the size of a man. The wind hit it again, and the fire exploded, a roaring, hungry beast that began to gallop across the field, consuming everything in its path with a sound like a freight train. For a moment, everyone was frozen by the sheer, terrifying speed of it. Then Laurel moved. She ran to the heavy iron bell by the cookhouse, the one used to call the hands for dinner, and began pulling the rope with a frantic, desperate energy. The harsh, panicked clang, clang, clang shattered the air. A frantic heartbeat of pure alarm, the sound broke the spell. Cole was already sprinting for the stables, shouting Hank's name. The fire break. Get the plows. The shovels. Anything now. He swung himself onto his horse, bareback, and galloped not towards the fire, but away from it, toward the low hills where the creek had been dammed to create a small reservoir for the summer. Hank, his face pale but his eyes clear and determined, was already organizing the 2 remaining ranch hands, his voice a gravelly roar that cut through the wind. Shovels, rakes, wet sacks, move. Nora ran from the house, her arms full of clean linen and a large jar of the burn salve she had prepared from aloe and comfrey root. The pump? She screamed to Laurel over the din. We need wet cloths for everyone. The community of Garnet Crossing heard the bell. They saw the ugly, roiling column of black smoke rising from the direction of the Cedar Mesa Ranch. For a long moment, the town was paralyzed by a collective, schadenfreude-laced hesitation. It was Maddox's trouble. Let him handle it. But then, something shifted. It started with Millie Rusk. She stood in the doorway of her saloon, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw the scale of the fire. She remembered the naked cruelty in Ellis Armitage's face, and she remembered the quiet, unbreakable dignity of the Vance widow. She had been wrong. This wasn't a morality play. This was a catastrophe. All right, you useless lummoxes, she bellowed at the men drinking in her saloon. Are you going to sit there and let a man's home burn down over a piece of gossip? She untied her apron. Ladies, she called to the women who had gathered in the street, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The Maddox place is burning. They'll need water, bandages, and hands. Let's go. It was like a dam breaking. Spurred by her unexpected leadership, the people of Garnet Crossing began to move. Men grabbed buckets and shovels. Women collected blankets and food, and a long, disorganized procession of wagons and riders began the journey out to the ranch. Their previous hostility forgotten in the face of a common, elemental enemy, at the ranch, the fight was desperate. Hank and his men worked like demons, creating a firebreak, a wide, raw scar of scraped earth designed to starve the fire of fuel. It was brutal, back-breaking work, the air thick with choking smoke and stinging ash. Cole reached the small, earthen dam and leaped from his horse, wrenching at the heavy, rusted wheel that controlled the sluice gate. The metal groaned in protest, but his desperation gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. With a final, agonized screech, the gate opened, and a muddy, life-giving torrent of water surged into the dry irrigation ditch that snaked its way down toward the burning pasture. The fire was a living entity, with a roar and a will of its own. It reached the firebreak and leaped across it in a dozen places, mocking their efforts. The night was lit with a hellish, dancing red glow, and the heat was so intense it blistered the skin. Laurel and Nora worked side by side at the pump, soaking burlap sacks and running them out to the men, their faces smudged with soot, their lungs burning with every breath. Just as the first of the townspeople arrived, a buggy, starkly clean and out of place in the chaos, pulled up. Deacon Barstow stepped out, his face a mask of solemn, pious concern. He held his Bible aloft. "We must pray," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. "We must pray for the souls of those in peril and for God's mercy to quench this infernal blaze." A few of the men, exhausted and overwhelmed, paused, looking to him for guidance. "The deacon's right," one of them shouted. "We need water. The church well is the deepest in the county." Barstow held up a hand. "My friends, we must be prudent. The church well is a sacred resource. It is for the town, for the parsonage. We cannot waste God's blessed water on a private matter that is clearly a sign of his displeasure." It was a monstrous, breathtaking act of sabotage, veiled in the language of faith. He was actively trying to stop them, to ensure the ranch burned. Laurel, her face black with soot, her hair coming undone, walked straight up to him. She was half his size, but she faced him with the fury of a she-bear defending her den. "The well may be on church land, Deacon," she said, her voice low and cold, vibrating with a rage that made him take an involuntary step back. "But the water belongs to God, and right now, God's work is being done with shovels, not with empty prayers. Now get out of the way, or pick up a bucket." The crowd stared, stunned into silence. They had seen the truth of him, stripped bare in the firelight. He was not a man of God. He was an arsonist of the soul. Millie Rusk spat on the ground near his polished boots. "You heard her. Deacon, help, or get the hell out," hissing. Barstow retreated to his buggy, his face a mask of thwarted fury, his plot unraveling before his eyes. The fight went on. Laurel found Cole on the fire line, his face a grim mask of soot, his shirt soaked with sweat and ditch water. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side as if they had been doing it their entire lives. He would beat at the flames with a wet sack, and she would follow, dousing the embers with a bucket of water. There was no need for words, a glance, a nod, a shared understanding forged in the heart of the inferno. The night was a red, roaring blur, their bodies aching, their senses overwhelmed, but they did not stop. They were a single, determined unit, a bulwark against the destruction. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire, the high, terrified bleating of the calves. Laurel's head snapped up. In the chaos of the fire's start, a small group of the youngest animals, including Juniper, had panicked and fled into a narrow box canyon at the edge of the pasture. Now, the fire was sweeping around the entrance, trapping them. "Hank!" Laurel screamed, pointing. "The calves." Hank saw it instantly. "The fence. If we can cut the wire on the far side, they might have a chance to get through to the creek bed." It was a desperate gamble. They ran, dodging embers and leaping over small lines of fire. Hank used a pair of heavy wire cutters, his powerful hands snipping the taut wire with a series of sharp cracks. But the calves, crazed with fear, wouldn't move. They huddled at the back of the canyon, their eyes wide with terror. "They won't cross the water ditch," Hank yelled. Laurel didn't hesitate. She plunged into the shallow, muddy irrigation ditch that Cole had opened, the cold water a shocking relief against her hot skin. She waded to the other side and climbed the bank, placing herself behind the trapped animals. "Hank, get ready." She began to move toward them, her arms outstretched, her voice low and soothing, the same calming tone she had used on Juniper in the barn. "Easy now. Easy, little ones. It's all right. Come on now. This way." Slowly, hesitantly, one of the calves took a step toward the opening, then another. Juniper, recognizing Laurel's voice, let out a low bleat and began to move. Laurel gently herded them forward, creating a living wall between them and the fire, guiding them toward the fence opening and the relative safety of the water. Just as the last calf scrambled through the opening, a gust of wind sent a sheet of flame roaring over the top of the canyon walls. Hank pulled her through the fence just in time, and they both fell, coughing and gasping, into the mud on the other side as the fire consumed the place where they had just been standing. As the first hints of dawn began to stain the sky, the tide began to turn. The wind, as if finally exhausted, shifted, turning back on the fire and pushing it toward the blackened, already burned section of the pasture. At the same time, the water from Cole's ditch reached the main fire line, its progress slowing to a sizzle and a hiss. The fight was not over, but the beast had been broken, exhausted, filthy, and sore. The ranchers and the townspeople stood together, leaning on their shovels, their faces a uniform mask of soot. They had won. The house was safe. The barns were safe. The ranch, though scarred, was still alive. And they looked at Laurel Vance, the quiet widow, the subject of their cruel gossip, and they saw a hero. They saw a woman who had faced down a deacon, who had run into the fire to save a herd, who had fought alongside them without complaint. The silence that fell was one of deep, profound, and unanimous respect. Cole found her standing at the edge of the blackened field, staring at the smoldering devastation. He walked up beside her. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. "Look," she whispered, pointing. The main pasture, the one that held their winter hay, was untouched, a sea of green in a world of black. "The water. You saved it." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on her face. "No," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion and an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You did. You organized the water line. You saved the calves. You saved our winter." He took her hand. Her small, blistered hand was lost in his large, grimy one. "You saved this place, Laurel." She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she was too tired to shed, and in that moment, all the barriers, all the fears, all the unspoken words, were burned away, leaving only a raw, undeniable truth. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was not about passion, but about survival. It was a tight, desperate, life-affirming hug. She buried her face in his chest, her hands clutching the back of his filthy shirt, and for the first time since her husband died, she felt safe, she felt anchored. He was the solid, unshakable center in a world that had just tried to burn itself to the ground. They stood there for a long, silent moment as the sun rose, two solitary figures in a landscape of ash, holding on as if they were the only two people left in the world. From his buggy on the road, Deacon Barstow watched the people of Garnet Crossing slap Cole Maddox on the back. He saw them gather around Laurel Vance, offering her water, offering her thanks. He heard the murmur of their admiration, the death knell of his carefully constructed smear campaign. His plan to take the land through force and fear was in ashes. He clenched his fists, his face twisting into a bitter sneer. "So be it," he hissed to himself. "If I can't take his land with fire, I will take his reputation with the law." Miles away, in the Santa Fe telegraph office, a clerk tapped out a short coded message. It was from Ellis Armitage to his partners at the railroad. It read, simply, "Plan A failed. Initiate Plan B." The makeshift courtroom was the train station's waiting room. The air was a thick concoction of coal smoke, oiled wood, and the dry, nervous sweat of 100 people packed onto hard wooden benches. The scales of justice, this day, would be weighed against the backdrop of train whistles and the rhythmic clatter of the telegraph machine from the station master's office. At the head of the room, on a raised platform normally used for loading baggage, sat a long trestle table. Behind it sat a woman who seemed entirely unimpressed by the rustic setting. Judge Inez Cortina was a small, compact woman in her late 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She wore the black robes of a federal circuit judge, but it was her eyes that commanded the room. They were the color of dark, polished obsidian, and they missed nothing. She looked out at the sea of faces ranchers, townsfolk, gossips, and conspirators with an expression of weary patience, like a schoolteacher about to preside over a particularly difficult class of unruly children. To her left sat Ellis Armitage and Deacon Barstow. Armitage was dressed in an expensive suit, his face a mask of smug confidence. Barstow sat beside him, his hands folded piously over his Bible, his expression one of solemn, aggrieved virtue. To her right sat Cole, Laurel, and Nora. Cole was stiff and unreadable in a clean but worn shirt, his hands resting on his knees. Nora was pale, her knuckles white where she gripped her reticule, and Laurel, in a simple, mended gray dress, looked small and fragile, yet her back was ramrod straight, and her gaze, when it met the judge's, was clear and unwavering. "This court is now in session," Judge Cortina announced, her voice clear and carrying, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. "We will first hear the civil matter of Armitage Freight versus the estate of the late Daniel Vance, represented by his widow, Mrs. Laurel Vance." Armitage rose, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He presented his case with the oily smoothness of a practiced predator, detailing the alleged debts, culminating in his most recent claim. "And finally, Your Honor, we have this contract for one steam-powered threshing machine, ordered and signed for by the deceased. The debt is substantial and long overdue." He handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Cortina examined the paper, her expression neutral. "Mrs. Vance, your response?" Laurel rose. She did not look at Armitage. She addressed the judge directly, her voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent room. "Your Honor, my husband was a farmer, not a fool. Our homestead was less than 40 acres. A steam thresher of the kind Mr. Armitage describes could thresh our entire wheat crop in less than an hour. It would have been an absurd and ruinous expense. He would never have ordered such a machine." "A touching sentiment, Your Honor," Armitage interjected with a sneer. "But it is not evidence. The signature is—" "Indeed," Laurel said, turning her cool gaze on him for the first time. "The signature is evidence, as is the ink." She turned back to the judge. "May I approach the bench, Your Honor?" Cortina nodded. Laurel walked to the table and, pointing with a steady finger, addressed the judge in a low, clear voice. "My husband passed away 2 years ago this past spring. That contract is signed in Higgins's ever-dry black ink. You can see the distinct, slightly purple sheen it has in the light." She paused. "Higgins's ever-dry went out of business 3 years ago. The last shipments of it came into this territory more than 30 months ago. It was known for fading. The ink on that page, Your Honor, is fresh. It's sharp and dark. It wasn't written 2 years ago." She then held up her own, much-abused letter from Armitage, the one demanding payment on the original, legitimate debt. "This letter, Your Honor, is from Mr. Armitage's own office, written last week. You will find, I believe, that the ink is a perfect match." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a detail so small, so precise, and so damning. Armitage's face went from smug to ashen in a heartbeat. Judge Cortina held the two documents side by side, her obsidian eyes missing nothing. The ink was, indeed, identical. "Mr. Armitage," the judge said, her voice dangerously soft, "do you have an explanation for this? Remarkable coincidence?" Armitage sputtered, his composure shattering. It's a clerk's copy. Of course, the original must be in our Santa Fe office." "Then I suggest you produce it," the judge said, her voice like chipping ice. "Until you do, this court finds this particular claim to be unsubstantiated. We will now move on to the matter of the attempted arson at the Cedar Mesa Ranch." Cole rose. He did not speak. He simply walked to the table and placed the muddy, water-stained saddlebag on the wood with a heavy thud. He opened it and laid out the contents, the surveyor's map with its red-inked boundaries, and the deed of sale. This was recovered from the person of Whit Fargo, leader of the Mesa Rats, on the night he and his men attempted to set fire to my hay barn. Cole stated, his voice a low, flat monotone. He pointed to the bottom of the deed. "The sale, Your Honor, was to be to Deacon Barstow. As you can see, it is authenticated by his personal seal." The crowd erupted in a roar of shocked murmurs. Barstow leaped to his feet. "Lies, a fabrication. This man is a known malcontent, a sinner who harbors a woman of loose morals." Silence. Judge Cortina's gavel cracked like a gunshot, silencing the room. "Deacon Barstow, you will sit. You will have your turn." She picked up the deed, examining the wax seal. "Mr. Maddox, do you have any witnesses to corroborate this claim?" "I do, Your Honor." Cole nodded to Hank Joslin. Hank walked to the bench, his face miserable but resolute. He recounted the night in the saloon, his own foolish words, and the way the ranchers had goaded him, repeating the whispers that had been circulating for weeks. And those whispers, Your Honor, they didn't start on their own. They were planted. "Objection," Barstow shouted. "Hearsay. The ramblings of a drunkard." "Overruled," the judge said flatly. She looked at Hank. "Who planted them?" "Mr. Joslin." Hank took a deep breath. "It was Deacon Barstow. Your Honor, I heard him myself, not a week before, talking to some folks. Talking about virtue and moral failings at the ranch. He was poisoning the well, making it so that when trouble did come, folks would be inclined to think Mr. Maddox had it comin'." Next, Millie Rusk was called. She confirmed Hank's account, her testimony sharp and direct. "The deacon was in my establishment," she said, her arms crossed. "He never drinks, but he's always listening. He'd drop a word here, a phrase there. A house in disarray, he'd say. A flock without a shepherd. He was laying the groundwork, making the whole town complicit in his slander." Finally, Deacon Barstow was given his chance to speak. He rose, clutching his Bible, the very picture of persecuted righteousness. "Your Honor, I am a simple servant of the Lord. My only concern has ever been for the moral fabric of this community. I saw a flock straying, a man and a woman living in a state of impropriety, and I spoke of it, as is my duty. I sought only to guide them back to the path of righteousness. This attack on my character is the work of the devil, using these sinners to strike at the very heart of this community's faith. He was a masterful performer." A few of his staunchest supporters in the crowd murmured, "Amen." Laurel rose one last time. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet words cut through his blustering defense like a razor. She looked directly at the deacon. Her gray eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound, unshakable certainty. "Morality," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, "doesn't need forged ink. Deacon, the simple, devastating truth of the statement hung in the air. It was the final, killing blow. It connected his pious hypocrisy directly to the cold, hard evidence of the fraudulent contract. Judge Cortina's face was grim. She had heard enough. Her gavel came down, a series of sharp, final cracks. On the matter of the debts claimed by Armitage Freight, this court finds a clear pattern of predatory lending and evidence of outright fraud. All outstanding debts against the Vance estate are hereby nullified. A wave of applause started, but she silenced it with a look. On the matter of the attempted arson, this court finds sufficient evidence to issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of one Whit Fargo. Furthermore, this court is opening a federal investigation into the business practices of Deacon Barstow and his potential involvement in a criminal conspiracy to defraud. It was a total, stunning victory. Nora burst into tears of relief, and even Cole's stern face broke into a grim smile. But Armitage wasn't finished. He had lost the legal battle, but he had one last, poisoned arrow in his quiver. He rose, his face a mask of pure reptilian venom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "before you adjourn, the good people of this town have a right to know the truth. The law may be blind, but the community is not. This man, Cole Maddox, has been sheltering this woman, this widow, in his home for weeks, unmarried, unchaperoned. He opened his door to her in the middle of the night while he was half-dressed. They are living together in sin, a disgrace to this entire community, and a stain on the honor of this territory." The air went out of the room. He had taken the ugly, whispered rumor and shouted it in the one place where it could do the most damage. He was trying to strip them of their victory, to shame them into ruin even after they had been legally vindicated, before Laurel could even react. Cole was on his feet. He did not look at Armitage. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the people who had judged him, fought a fire with him, and now judged him again. "My honor," Cole said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that resonated through the entire station, "is to shelter the innocent from vultures like him. My honor is to give a decent, hard-working woman a chance when the world has given her none. If that is a sin in your eyes, then I am a sinner, and I will answer for it to God, not to Ellis Armitage." He sat down. The silence was profound. Then Nora stood up, her face tear-streaked, but her voice strong. "You want to talk about what Laurel Vance has done since she came to Cedar Mesa?" she asked the crowd. "She saved my life when I was sick with a fever. She saved our calf, Juniper, from the colic. She saved our entire winter hay crop by spotting the arsonist's plan. She ran into a canyon to save our herd from a wildfire. She has cooked for us, mended for us, and fought for us." Nora's voice broke, but she pushed on, her gaze sweeping the room. "She hasn't been a burden on our home. She has been its salvation." A single person began to clap. It was Millie Rusk. Then Hank Jocelyn joined in, his applause loud and defiant. Then the blacksmith, Mr. Henderson, then the Gables. It was not a cheer. It was not a rowdy celebration. It was a slow, deep, rhythmic applause. It was the sound of a community making a choice, a profound, supportive, and deeply respectful sound that acknowledged a truth greater than any rumor. It was the sound of acceptance. In the midst of it, Laurel looked at Cole. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her. And in that moment, under the gaze of the entire town, she made a silent, internal vow. The world had thrown its worst at them: conspiracy, fire, and shame, and they had not only survived, they had prevailed. They had stood together. The question of love was no longer a matter of if, but when. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the choice would be hers to make, on her own terms, when everything was finally, truly, made right. The night that followed the trial was a deep, velvet exhalation. The oppressive, angry sky had finally broken, and a gentle, cleansing rain fell over Cedar Mesa. It was not the violent, hammering storm of Laurel's arrival, but a soft, steady sigh that muted the world, washing the ash from the air and the lingering tension from the ground. Inside the ranch house, the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth, a steady, domestic heartbeat that affirmed they were safe, they were home. Laurel stood at the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. She was exhausted, her bones aching with a weariness that went deeper than the fire or the courtroom, but she was not tired. She was, for the first time in memory, utterly, profoundly awake. The verdict had been more than a legal victory. It had been an emancipation. The chains of her past, the debts of her late husband, the suffocating cloak of shame and gossip, all of it had been nullified by Judge Cortina's gavel. She was, at last, a free woman, standing on solid ground, and yet she was restless. The small cot in the pantry, which had been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. She was drawn to the porch, to the sound of the rain. She opened the front door quietly, not wanting to wake Nora, and stepped out. She stopped, her hand on the doorframe. He was already there. Cole was not looking out at the rain. He was sitting on the top step, waiting. He had known she would come. He had prepared for her. His heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had wrapped her in during the sandstorm, was spread neatly on the wooden step, a dry, warm place for her to sit. Beside him, 2 tin mugs steamed in the cool night air, sending up the sharp, sweet scent of ginger. He didn't speak, but simply patted the coat beside him. She came and sat, pulling a corner of the heavy coat over her legs. He handed her one of the mugs. The tea was hot and strong, the ginger a welcome fire in her belly. For a long time, they sat in a silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. They listened to the rhythm of the rain, a gentle percussion on the tin roof, a soft hiss as it met the thirsty earth. The war was over, the battle had been won, and in the quiet aftermath, there was only the truth. "You're not afraid of much," Laurel said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw you ride at the fire. I saw you in that courtroom. I've never seen you flinch." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his mug. When he spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, raw, with a vulnerability she had never heard. "That's not true. I am afraid of one thing. I have been, for 5 years." He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers in the shadows. "I'm afraid of this." "This," she asked, not understanding. "This feeling, the house being warm again, the smell of bread in the kitchen, the sound of someone else's breathing in the next room." He took a shaky breath. "My mother died in that room upstairs. It was influenza. It was fast. And it was brutal. And when she was gone, this house, it didn't just get quiet. It died. And I swore I would never let anything hurt me like that again. I built a wall. Laurel. I made it cold on purpose. Because if you don't let the warmth in, you don't feel the cold when it's gone." His confession hung in the air, a painful, honest, and devastating admission. He was the man who had faced down fire and conspirators, the man who was the rock of the whole mesa, and he was terrified of being abandoned. "I let Elizabeth go," he continued, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I told myself it was because she hated the land, but that was a lie. I sent her away because I was a coward. I was afraid she'd leave me, so I left her first, and I've been alone, and safe, ever in." He looked at her, his face a mask of old pain. "Until you came, in the rain, and you, and Nora, and that damned calf. You knocked the whole wall down, and I'm terrified." Laurel felt her heart ache for him. She set her mug down and turned to face him fully. "I know about that fear, Cole, but mine is different." "Different how?" "You're afraid of being left," she said softly. "I'm afraid I'm not worthy of being kept." He frowned, not understanding. "Laurel, after everything, the fire, the court, you're the strongest person I've ever known." "That's not what I mean." Her voice was quiet, but it vibrated with an old, deep shame. "I came here with nothing, a widow in a wet dress, begging for shelter, a pity case. Hank called me, and he was right. Every day I've been here. I've worked to prove I'm not a burden. I've been trying to earn my place, cooking, mending, healing, fighting. I've been paying my rent, and I'm afraid. Afraid of what? He asked, his voice gentle. I'm afraid of what happens now, she whispered, the confession tearing from her. The trial is over. The work is done. What happens when you don't need me anymore? What happens when I'm just Laurel? Am I enough to stay then? Or do I become a burden you're too kind to cast out? Her fear, so long hidden, was finally spoken. She was terrified that she was only valuable, not precious. Cole stared at her, his heart breaking. He finally, truly, understood the ironclad pride, the refusal of his money, the relentless, driven way she worked. It wasn't just survival, it was a desperate plea to be seen as worthy. He set his own mug down with a definitive, metallic click. He turned, his entire body angled toward her. May I hold your hand, Laurel? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. It was a question of pure, formal respect. She looked at his outstretched hand. It was not the hand of a boss or a protector. It was the hand of a man, vulnerable and asking. She slowly, deliberately, placed her small, scarred hand into his large, calloused one. His fingers closed around hers. It was not a brief, polite touch. It was a long, warm, encompassing grasp. It was an anchor. It was a promise. He held her hand as if he were holding the most valuable, precious thing in the world. He lifted it and brushed his lips against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. You are not worthy of this place, he said, his voice thick. This place is not worthy of you. He leaned in, as he had on the porch before, but this was not the tentative, rain-chilled kiss of two people finding their footing. This was a kiss of knowing. It was slow, and it was deep, and it was as gentle as the rain that fell around them. It was a kiss of profound relief, a kiss that tasted of ginger and salt and the end of a long, lonely war. It was a kiss that said, "You are home. You are enough. You are everything." She leaned into him, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw, her fingers tracing the line of his beard. He moved his other hand to her waist, drawing her closer. The cool night air swirled around them, but where they touched, they were fire, behind them, through the window of the front room. The glass began to fog, obscuring the world outside, insulating them in a small, private world of their own. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low, and their two shadows, cast long against the wall, merged and became one. He pulled back, but only an inch, resting his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air. "When things are right," he whispered, reminding her of her promise. "Things are right, Cole," she whispered back. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He kept her hand in his, lacing his fingers through hers, and led her inside, away from the rain and the cold. He led her past the pantry, past the cold cot, past the dark, empty spaces. He led her toward the warmth of the fire, toward the heart of the house. He closed the front door, and the soft click of the latch was a sound of finality. The story of that night was written not in a language of frantic passion, but in the quiet, steady language of the hearth. The embers in the fireplace, which had been a low, sleepy glow, suddenly caught a draft from the opening door. A small, new flame licked at a piece of dry cedar. It caught and flared, and a moment later the entire log ignited, burning not with a wild, consuming rage, but with a bright, steady, and brilliant light. It filled the room with a deep, radiant warmth, and it burned that way, unwavering, long into the night. The next morning, the sun broke over the mesa, clear and sharp, washing the world in a clean golden light. The air was crisp, tasting of wet cedar and new beginnings. Cole was already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, its rich aroma filling the air. He heard a soft footfall on the stairs, not the creak of the back stairs from the pantry, but the solid, quiet tread on the main staircase. Laurel appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her mended gray dress, her hair neatly brushed and tied back. She held a woolen blanket in her arms, folded with perfect, crisp corners. It was the one he kept in the chest at the foot of his bed. She paused when she saw him, and a shy, lovely smile touched her lips, a blush rising on her cheeks. She looked settled. She looked like she belonged. He didn't speak, but his eyes were warm. He turned, poured a mug of coffee, and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. It was not the electric jolt of their first touches, but a simple, comfortable, domestic warmth. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full. Everything had changed. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied, his voice a low, happy rumble. Nora came bounding in, her face bright. She stopped, taking in the scene. She saw Laurel. She saw Cole. She saw the folded blanket in Laurel's arms. And she saw the easy, quiet peace between them. A wide, knowing grin split her face. "Well," Nora said, her voice bright with teasing, "the coffee smells different this morning. Better." Laurel blushed deeper. But Nora just laughed, a sound of pure joy. She crossed the room and pulled Laurel into a fierce, tight hug. "You know," Nora whispered, her voice suddenly thick with emotion, "your trial week ended a long time ago. I think it's finally time you started calling this place home. Laurel, because it wouldn't be home without you." Laurel hugged her back, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Nora." Later, Laurel stepped out onto the porch to breathe in the clean morning air. On the rough-hewn wooden railing, there was a small, clumsy bundle of wildflowers, their stems wrapped in twine. It was a handful of Indian paintbrush, the same fiery red flowers she had picked for the kitchen table. There was no note. She didn't need one. She knew they were from Hank. It was his apology, his peace offering, and his pledge of respect, all in one. As she stood there, a lone rider approached, moving at a steady official clip. It was a deputy from Garnet Crossing. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Maddox," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He handed Cole a letter. "From Judge Cortina." Cole broke the seal and read it aloud, his voice clear in the morning air. The judge's justice had been as swift as her verdict. Deacon Barstow had been formally stripped of his clerical duties by the territorial bishop, and all his assets, including the lands he had been acquiring for the railroad, were frozen pending a full federal investigation into his conspiracy. As for Ellis Armitage, upon learning that his conspiracy was exposed and his political cover was gone, he had packed his bags, withdrawn all claims, and taken the first train back to Santa Fe. A ruined and disgraced man. The shadows were gone. All of them. Laurel let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 2 years. A profound, deep, and utter peace settled over her. It was over. Cole folded the letter and stepped beside her. He slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close to his side. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood together, watching the sun climb over their land. It was a perfect, quiet moment of a new beginning, but the peace was, as peace on the mesa often is, short-lived. Far in the distance, on the high, sun-drenched rim of the canyon, a new shadow appeared. It was not the familiar shape of a rancher or a lost cow. It was a lone figure, still as stone, watching the house with a patience that was deeply unsettling. The figure raised a hand, not in a wave, but to shield their eyes, a glint of sunlight reflecting off something metal in their grasp. The stranger had arrived. The peace was a fiction. They had won in the courtroom. But the law was a distant, civilized thing. The wild, jagged heart of the mesa still answered to older, more brutal rules. They learned this the next afternoon. Nora had taken a basket and gone to gather wild sage from the low hills behind the house, a simple, peaceful chore she had done 100 times. When she didn't return for supper, a knot of cold dread began to form in Laurel's stomach. Cole, his face grim, went out to look for her. He found her basket lying on its side, the sage spilled across the ground. Beside it, pinned to the earth with a rusty skinning knife, was a piece of dirty paper. The handwriting was a crude, angry scrawl. "Maddox, you have something of mine. The paper's from the bag. I have something of yours. The girl, come to Dry Needle Bluff at dawn. Alone, bring the deed, or I'll send her back in pieces." It was signed with a single, jagged letter F. Fargo. The name was a lit fuse, the calm, steady man who had faced down a courtroom dissolved, replaced by a creature of pure white-hot rage. Cole's face became a terrible, granite mask. He stormed into the house, grabbing his rifle from the rack and a box of cartridges from the mantel. "Cole, what are you doing?" Laurel cried, her heart seizing with terror. "I'm going to get my sister," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl she had never heard. He wasn't checking his saddle. He wasn't packing supplies. He was walking into the night, a man intent on violence. "Alone like he says. It's a trap," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. He shook her off, his eyes wild. "It's my fight, my sister. And you'll be riding straight into his guns." Laurel stood in front of the door, blocking his path. For a terrifying second, she thought he might push her aside. "Cole, stop, think. This is what he wants. He wants you angry. He wants you stupid. He wants you dead." Her words, sharp and clear, seemed to penetrate the red haze of his fury. He stopped, his chest heaving, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. He looked at her, and she saw the raw, terrified man beneath the rage. "He has Nora," he whispered, the words ragged. "I know," she said, her voice softening. "And we are going to get her back, but we will do it our way, not his." She pulled him to the kitchen table, where the big territorial map was still spread out. She lit a lamp, its golden light pushing back the shadows. "Dry Needle Bluff," she said, her finger tracing the jagged contour lines. "It's a fortress, one way in, one way out. He'll have a man on the ridge, watching the approach. You'd be silhouetted against the sunrise before you got within a mile." She moved her finger away from the main trail, to a series of tightly packed lines that indicated a steep, almost sheer drop. "But here," she said, tapping the map. "This is Raven Switchback. It's not really a trail. It's a goat path. A series of crumbling ledges that comes up the back of the bluff. It's dangerous, but it's hidden. They won't be watching it." Cole stared at the map, his breathing slowing, the tactical part of his brain re-engaging. He saw the logic in her plan. He saw the chance. "How do you know that path?" "My husband and I hunted these hills," she said softly. "I know the cracks in this land better than I know the lines on my own hand." The plan was forged in the quiet desperation of that kitchen. They would not be victims. They would be hunters. Cole's rage was channeled into cold, precise preparation. He packed a long coil of hemp rope and checked his revolver. Laurel gathered supplies for Nora, a water skin, bandages, and a small, powerful vial of smelling salts from Nora's own medical kit. And in a small leather pouch, she placed a signal whistle, a simple, high-pitched thing Cole used to call his dogs. She also took a small, silver-backed hand mirror from her satchel. Hank, when told the news, did not hesitate. His face went pale, but his jaw was set like iron. "What do you need me to do, boss?" "You're the decoy, Hank," Cole said, handing him the oilskin pouch containing the map and deed. "You'll ride the main trail. Make it look good. Ride slow. When you get to the base of the bluff, make a show of leaving the pouch under a rock. Then ride out. He'll see you. His lookout will see you. It'll buy us time." "And if they come after me?" Hank asked, his voice steady. "They won't," Cole said. "Fargo wants me, not you. He'll wait." They rode out under the cold, indifferent light of 1,000 stars, splitting up a mile from the bluff. Hank continued on the main trail. A lone, brave figure riding toward the lion's den. Cole and Laurel turned their horses into the deep shadows of the canyons, toward the treacherous ascent of Raven Switchback. The climb was a nightmare. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on one side and a crumbling rock face on the other. Their horses, sure-footed as they were, slipped and stumbled, sending showers of loose shale clattering into the darkness below. Twice, Cole had to dismount and lead both animals, his hands braced against the rock wall, his boots fighting for purchase. Laurel followed, her heart in her throat, her eyes scanning the rock face above them for any sign of a lookout. As the first pale hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, they reached a narrow ledge just below the rim of the bluff. They could hear voices now, low and rough, from the camp above. They had made it. They tied the horses, their breath pluming in the cold air. Cole peered over the edge. The camp was a small, natural amphitheater of rock. Nora was there. She was tied to a piñon tree, her face pale and smudged with dirt, but her eyes were wide and defiant. Fargo stood by a small fire, his rifle cradled in his arms. A single lookout stood on the far ridge, his back to them, watching Hank's slow progress on the trail below. The sun was just beginning to crest the distant mountains, sending long, golden shafts of light across the landscape. "The lookout," Cole whispered. "I can't get to Nora without him seeing me." Laurel didn't speak. She pulled the small, silver-backed mirror from her pouch. She angled it, catching the first brilliant ray of the rising sun, a blinding, intense flash of light, as sharp and sudden as a diamond, shot across the canyon and struck the lookout directly in the eyes. He cried out, stumbling back, his hands flying to his face. "My eyes, I can't see." It was the opening they needed, but in that same moment, Nora acted. She had been working at her bonds for hours, the rough hemp scraping her wrists raw. She had managed to work one hand free. She saw the flash, heard the cry. Her hand darted to the small pouch at her belt where she always kept a few essential supplies. Her fingers closed around the signal whistle Laurel had given her. She brought it to her lips and blew with all her might. The sound was shockingly loud in the morning stillness, a piercing, high-pitched shriek that cut through the air. Fargo spun around, his face a mask of fury. Realizing he'd been tricked, he raised his rifle, not at Cole, but at Nora. "No!" Cole roared. He scrambled over the ledge, not thinking, not planning, his only instinct to put his body between Fargo's rifle and his sister. He charged forward, a human shield, but Fargo was off balance, startled by the whistle and the lookout's cry. He took a half-step back, his boot heel catching on a loose rock. He stumbled. In that split second of instability, Laurel moved. The rope was already in her hand, a coiled, living thing. She had been raised with ropes. She knew their weight, their balance, their power. With a flick of her wrist, a motion as fluid and natural as breathing, she sent a loop of the heavy hemp spinning through the air. It uncoiled perfectly, snaking around Fargo's ankles just as he tried to regain his footing. She pulled back with all her strength. Fargo's legs were yanked out from under him. He hit the ground with a heavy, bone-jarring thud, his rifle flying from his grasp. The shot went wild, whining harmlessly off the canyon wall. Cole was on him in an instant, his knee on Fargo's chest, his knife at the man's throat. Laurel was already at Nora's side, her own knife sawing through the ropes. The fight was over. No one was dead. Fargo and his dazed lookout were securely bound with their own ropes. Left for the posse that Judge Cortina, informed by a fast-riding Hank, had already dispatched from Garnet Crossing, Nora collapsed into Laurel's arms, her body racked with trembling shivers of relief. Laurel held her tight. "I'm here now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. We're all safe." It was not just a reassurance. It was a statement of fact, a promise that bound the three of them into a new, unbreakable unit. This was her family, and she would move heaven and earth to protect it. The ride home was a quiet, exhausted procession. As they descended from the high country, the sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to darken. A storm was gathering, the air growing thick and heavy. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the canyons. The rain started as they reached the open plains. A sudden, cold downpour. They took shelter under a wide, jutting overhang of red rock, the water cascading in a silver curtain just feet from where they stood. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant, instantaneous flash that illuminated their faces filthy, exhausted, and gloriously alive. In the stark, momentary light, their eyes met, and a sound, unexpected and slightly hysterical, bubbled up from Cole's chest. He started to laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. The sound of a man who had walked to the edge of the abyss and back. Laurel, seeing the wild, beautiful joy on his face, joined in, her own laughter mixing with his, the sound echoing in their small, rocky shelter. When their laughter finally subsided, a profound, intimate silence settled between them. Cole reached out and gently brushed a stray, rain-soaked strand of hair from her cheek. His voice, when he spoke, was a rough, quiet thing, stripped of all its usual defenses. "I've loved you since the first night," he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "When you came in out of the rain, looking like a drowned cat, and still had the grit to face me down, I think I knew then. I was just too afraid to admit it." Laurel's heart felt like it would burst. She looked at this strong, complicated, and wonderful man, at the home he had built, at the family he had protected. "And I love the home you kept warm for me, Cole Maddox," she answered, her voice trembling. "Even when you didn't know you were doing it." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the desert scrubbed clean and glistening. They rode the rest of the way side by side, their horses moving in a comfortable, easy rhythm. The setting sun broke through the clouds, and their shadows stretched out long before them on the wet red sand. Two figures moving as one. A silent, graceful waltz of two riders who had finally found their way home. As they neared Garnet Crossing, they saw a strange, flickering light. It wasn't the single lamp of the saloon, but dozens of them. The entire town was waiting for them. As they rode down the main street, people emerged from their homes and businesses, holding lanterns aloft. Millie Rusk, Hank Jocelyn, the Gables, the blacksmith, they were all there. They didn't cheer or shout. They simply stood in the twilight, their lanterns held high, a silent, glowing vigil of support and relief. The town was no longer a place of whispers and suspicion. It was a community. It was a family, welcoming its own. The dawn that broke over Cedar Mesa was a new creation, a fresh, clean wind, born in the high peaks, swept down through the canyons, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a wind of change, and it whispered through the cedar trees, not with the mournful howl of a storm, but with the gentle, promising sigh of a new season. At the ranch, a simple clothesline had been strung between two porch posts, and from it hung a string of small, colorful flags, cut from scraps of calico and flour sacks. They danced and fluttered in the new wind, a humble, joyful announcement. It was a wedding day. There was no church, no organ, no pews full of stiffly dressed strangers. The ceremony was to be held in the open air, in the yard that had been a place of mud and blood and ash, now scrubbed clean and filled with the warmth of a gathered community. Long trestle tables had been set up, covered in checkered cloths. The whole of Garnet Crossing, it seemed, was there, their faces not pinched with suspicion, but open and smiling. The officiant was a woman who believed in the law of the land and the higher law of what was right. Judge Inez Cortina stood on the porch steps, her black robes looking strangely at home against the rustic wood. She had delayed her departure by a day, stating that it was her judicial duty to see justice fully served, and a proper union was the final, most fitting verdict. The wedding cake, a magnificent three-tiered cornmeal and honey creation, was the masterpiece of Millie Rusk, the saloon owner. Her face flushed with pride and heat from the ovens, had worked all night, a penance and a gift all in one. And standing beside Cole, his back straight, his hands clasped awkwardly behind his back, was the best man. Hank Jocelyn was almost unrecognizable. He had shaved his grizzled, tobacco-stained beard, revealing a square, honest jaw no one had seen in years. He was scrubbed clean and wore a borrowed suit. His eyes, for the first time, holding a look of simple, unadulterated happiness for his boss. In his pocket, he carefully guarded two simple, hammered gold rings that Cole had commissioned from the town blacksmith. Nora, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, performed the final ritual. She took a sprig of fresh, fragrant sage, the same kind she had been gathering when she was taken, and gently tucked it into Laurel's hair, which was coiled in a simple, elegant braid. "For protection, for healing, and for home," Nora whispered, her voice thick with love. Laurel, wearing a simple borrowed dress of pale blue cotton that matched her eyes, looked not like a bride weighed down by finery, but like a woman stepping into the sunlight after a long, dark winter. And then there was Cole. He emerged from the house, and a hush fell over the crowd. He was wearing a stark white shirt, freshly starched and ironed. It was the first time anyone, including his own sister, had seen him in anything other than the rough, dark work clothes of a rancher in years. The white shirt was a symbol, a stark, brilliant banner of his surrender to a new life. He looked younger. The hard lines of his face softened, the perpetual guard in his eyes replaced by a quiet, profound awe as he looked at Laurel. They stood before the judge, hand in hand, the wind gently rustling the small flags above them. Judge Cortina did not read from a book of flowery scripture. She spoke from the heart. "We are gathered here," she began, her voice clear and strong, "not just to join two people, but to celebrate the rebuilding of a home. We have all seen the trials this house has endured. We have seen it threatened by lies, by greed, and by fire, and we have seen it stand, made stronger not by timbers and nails alone, but by the courage and character of the people within it." She looked at Cole, then at Laurel. "Do you have vows?" Cole cleared his throat, his gaze never leaving Laurel's face. "Laurel," he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I was a man living in a cold house. I had forgotten what warmth was. You brought the fire back, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that lights the dark and keeps the winter at bay. I promise to be the wall that breaks the wind for you. Always." Laurel's eyes glistened. She squeezed his hand. "Cole," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "I was a soul adrift, with no anchor and no harbor. You gave me shelter, not just from a storm, but from the world." She took a deep breath, and then she spoke the words that were the truest vow of all, a promise that was not just for him, but for everyone listening. "Together," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction born of shared hardship, "we will keep this home warm for any tired soul who finds their way to our door. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, and by the higher authority of all that is good and right in this world," the judge declared, a rare, brilliant smile on her face, "I pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss was gentle, a quiet sealing of a promise that had already been made in 100 unspoken ways. The crowd did not whoop or holler. Instead, a wave of warm, heartfelt applause rolled through the yard, and rough, calloused hands began to tap out a happy, rhythmic beat on the wooden tables. A lone fiddler, one of the ranchers from a neighboring spread, struck up a simple, sweet melody, and the celebration began. The feast was as honest and as wholesome as the vows. There were huge pots of bean soup, mountains of cornbread baked by the women of the town, and jars of wild honey. The stories of the past few weeks were retold, but the fear and the horror were gone. They were no longer tales of a brutal attack and a terrifying fire. They had become the founding myth of a new family, a legend of how the community had come together, how a brave woman had saved the calves, how a good man had stood his ground. The dark memories were being transformed. burnished by the light of a happy day into something beautiful and strong. As evening fell, the crowd thinned, the families heading home in their wagons, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The porch was lit by the warm, golden glow of a dozen oil lamps. The fiddler played a slow, sweet waltz, and Cole took Laurel in his arms. They danced, moving in a slow, easy circle, their steps perfectly matched. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They communicated in the quiet language of smiling eyes and the gentle pressure of a hand on the small of a back. They were home. Later, when the last guest had departed and the ranch was quiet, they stood on that same porch, now husband and wife. The night was gentle, the air soft and cool. He took her hand and led her inside. The camera of the mind did not follow. It remained outside, watching as the front door closed with a soft, final click. It saw the lamplight in the front room glow for a while, and then go dark. It saw the gentle flicker of the fireplace through the window, a warm, living heart in the center of the house, and it heard only the quiet murmur of the night, the soft sigh of the wind, and the steady, rhythmic crackle of the fire, like two heartbeats finally, peacefully, in sync. The next morning, a new sign hung at the gate to the ranch. It was carved from a single, solid piece of cedar. The letters burned deep into the wood. It did not just say Maddox. It read, Cedar Mesa Ranch, home of the Maddox-Vance family. The old wounds of the community began to heal. Ellis Armitage was never seen in Garnet Crossing again, his name becoming a local byword for greed and cowardice. Deacon Barstow, stripped of his authority and his ill-gotten land, remained, a diminished figure who now preached sermons on the virtues of humility and forgiveness to a congregation that watched his every move with wary, knowing eyes. The town had made its choice. It had chosen fairness. It had chosen kindness. It had chosen to stand with the house that fire could not destroy. The final image of this story is not of a dramatic showdown or a passionate embrace. It is of a simple, quiet afternoon a few weeks later. The sky is a vast, cloudless blue, the land washed clean by the recent rains. 4 figures walk through the high green pasture, the one that was saved from the fire. Cole and Laurel walk side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing. A little ahead of them is Nora, her basket full of herbs, her step light and free, and trotting happily at their heels, nudging at Laurel's hand for a scratch behind the ears, is the orphan calf, Juniper, now strong and healthy. They walk together, a family, their long shadows stretching out behind them in the afternoon sun, moving as one into the quiet, promising future. For there are some homes that are built by hand, and there are others that are held together by the heart. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. To hear more tales from the frontier, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you truly enjoyed this journey, consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you. Your support means the world.